Welcome back, everybody, to Cool's Interviews. This week, we get to talk about Edgar Allan Poe, E.A. Poe, or Edgar Poe, as he probably would have gone back in his time. But we get to talk with Mark Dawidziak, and he's written quite a few books. It looks like about 25. And it covers anything from The Night Stalker to The Twilight Zone. And of course, this book, A Mystery of Mysteries, The Death and Life of Edgar Allan Poe. And so I will turn it over to Mark and let him introduce himself better, because obviously he knows himself much better than I do.
Well, we could do this the short way, which is just to say, well, Mark's a writer and leave it at that, because that's accurate and it's true. But I've been a professional writer for about 45 years. And for the majority of those 45 years, I followed the newspaper trail and was in basically as a TV and film critic for most of those 43 years. So for most of my professional life, I haven't had to work for a living, basically, is what it comes down to. I got paid for going to the movies and watching television. And, I found out a long time ago, there's no way to make that job sound bad. Try it. Try to make that sound bad to somebody. Try to make somebody feel sorry for you because you get paid for doing that. You can't. So I was very fortunate. I had a lovely long run in journalism, the newspapers, 43 years, which came to an end about 3 years ago. And I've also been writing. I've had the mania for writing books all during that time. My first book was published 40 years ago. It was A Slice of Theater History, which was published in 1982. Since then, anybody who is looking at the books on my resume would be excused for thinking it is a terribly schizophrenic resume. It is certainly that. I like to tell the story about the person who went past my table at a book fair once and looked down at all the books and did a bit of a double take, looked down at the books, looked up at me, back at the books, and then said, "I don't get it." And I said, "Well, I don't. What's not to get?" And he said, "Well, what's the common theme? All these books are about different things. There's Mark Twain. There's TV stuff here. There's horror stuff. What's the common?" And I said, "Me. I'm the common theme. These are all my interests and passions, and I don't like repeating myself. I don't like climbing the same mountain over and over again. So the books are wildly different, but that's because my interests are not confined." Vincent Price once beautifully said that the person who limits his interests limits his life. He was not talking about Edgar Allan Poe, by the way, but that's a great description of Edgar Allan Poe, even before we get into the main topic. But it's kind of advice I've taken to heart myself. So the books are all different things, but I am constantly drawn back, I guess, to what I would call the spooky side of the street. Because there is a book on Dracula. There is a book on the Kolchak series, The Night Stalker. There is a horror novel. There is a book on the Twilight Zone. There's a book on the Shawshank Redemption and includes interviews with Stephen King. So it's not odd, I guess, that I was eventually got to Edgar Allan Poe, because that is a constant in there, even though there are books on Theodore Roosevelt and Mark Twain and all the other things. It is a constant as far as I'm concerned. But I'm just, I'm one of those fortunate people who have been able to make a living by putting nouns and verbs together for the majority of my life. And that's what I set out to do. It's what I've been able to do. And I hope I get to do it for a few more years yet.
Yeah, no, like you said, you have a ton of great topics, and it's something that our channel does is, we've had people comment on some of our videos. Well, we came because it said paranormal, but they have a lot of dinosaur videos, so we stayed for that. So yeah, I definitely agree. It's always good to have a diverse interest. I did see something about the 2015 Journalism Hall of Fame induction.
That was the Cleveland Journalism Hall of Fame, and they came. I don't. Yeah, I was very honored, but don't get me wrong. I don't want to downplay that at all, and sort of dig my toe in the dirt and yeah, sure. But it was certainly a wonderful honor to get. I've just never put much stock in awards, and if you could look around this labyrinthian office of mine, which is at the top of our house, which we call the bell tower because it's at the top of the house, and there are all but you'll see bits and pieces of all the various writing sections of my life. So and my interest. I mean, there's my original 13 Aurora monster models from the 1960s are over here. All the originals are right over there. All my Mark Twain stuff is in over here, which is more than like 700 volumes of about Mark Twain. If you look at different sections, you'll see sections dedicated to the Twilight Zone or Edgar Allan Poe. But I don't put out the awards. I don't put out any award I've ever won or anything like that, because I think those are they're slippery slopes. You know, if somebody offers you an award, you show up and you say thank you.
Mhm.
That's the proper thing to do. But you don't internalize it, and you don't all of a sudden think you're suddenly a better writer because somebody has handed you an award. Well, I mean, because then you have to go to the flip side. But does that mean last year when I didn't win an award, I was a lesser writer because of that? Or the people who I was in competition with were better last year, but I'm better than them this year? You can play with your head after a while if you let it. So anytime anybody has offered me an award for something, I'm very grateful, and I've always said very much thank you. But I've never sort of gotten to that point of putting them out or lining my office with them, because I think I once was talking to a writer who felt bad, was having a sort of a pity party because he had never won an award for writing. Very gifted writer, and he was saying like they should give me an award called the I've never won shit award, because I've never won anything. Like, oh, come on. And as I told him then, I said, I have been fortunate. I've won a closet full of awards, and do you know where I keep them? In the closet. That's where I keep them, because if you take them out, you all of a sudden are saying I'm a better writer because of all of this, and I think that's nonsense. So, I like I said, so it came towards the end of my journalism career. Is a very nice honor to have, and most of it was based on the fact of having been a TV and film critic all those years.
Yeah, no, and if my words mean anything, I definitely think you're a good writer. I really enjoyed the book. Just so much of your personality came through while I was reading it. It didn't just feel like a run of the mill biography, which
Well,
I know is something you were aiming for.
it is. This is another word that I don't like, which is style. Because that's a very highfalutin word, and I think that's up to other people to decide if you have one, and B, if you do have one, what is it like? So but if I do have any kind of style, and that's been developed over the years, it is conversational. I do try to engage people with the way I write, and I do emphasize a voice that's coming through. This was particularly true of the Twilight Zone book. I think the Twilight Zone book that's my wife's favorite book of all the books I've done, and because it took the form of like 50 essays or 50 conversations, if you will, and I drew very heavily on my own life and my own experiences for that book. It has the most of me in there of any book that I've ever written. I think that's why it's my wife's favorite. But anything I write, I try to bring a certain amount. I write to be read. I'm not saying I always succeed, and I'm not saying that everybody who reads this book will agree with what you said. I'm sure there were some people who will read it and say, nah, it's too stuffy, it's too boring, or whatever. You're never going to reach everybody. You're never going to hit everybody's taste, as far as I'm concerned. But it's the best I can do. When I was starting my career in the late 70s, early 80s, I started at small newspapers in the South, in Upper East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia. And part of what I did was I covered country and bluegrass music. Yankee boy from New York covering country music. But I grew up listening to country music because one of the great country music stations in the world, and certainly the biggest, was not in Nashville. It was in New York City. You were, around where I grew up. And that's because there were so many more people in New York. Nashville's a small town. New York City has 15 million people. It did back then. So you had this great country music station. I grew up listening to it. And they didn't play a lot of Nashville sound junk. You got a lot of Johnny Cash and Marty Robbins, Roger Miller, some really great stuff. And I was like, what's happening in Nashville? Boy. And then later on you found, oh, there's all this junk that also gets produced for this. But it kind of got me very interested. So when I began my career in that area, I was writing a weekly column about country music, and I got to interview a lot of the people who were stars in country music then. And there was a quartet, the Statler brothers, who were very well known back then. And I went to their hometown of Stanton, Virginia, to interview them, and I asked the style question, and their bass, Harold Reed, who was also sort of their class clown. He said something it's always stuck with me. He said, it's a good question, and I don't think I'd want to think about it too much because it would really mess with your mind if you did. He said, but our style is basically just going out there and doing the best we can. I thought that was a great answer. That was a fantastic, and I've stolen that line so many times over the years. It's doing the best I can. That's what my style is.
Well, that's something you kind of talk about in your book too, is like a style, we should say genre, and how Edgar Allan Poe was kind of like pigeonholed by modern audiences into the horror genre, even though he's rather diverse.
Well, yeah, we've done that. Poe himself would be, I think if Poe could come back from the dead, which would be very Edgar Allan Poe-ish thing to do in his stories, because people do that all the time. But if Poe could come back and observe his fame, I think he'd have a very ambivalent response to it. And on the one hand, I think he would be delighted that he is universally recognized and universally known. That the people know him, they know what he looks like, and they know his stories, because everybody gets Edgar Allan Poe.
Mm-hmm.
You got Edgar Allan Poe probably around the 7th grade. Your parents got Edgar Allan Poe. Your grandparents got Edgar Allan Poe. Your children will get Edgar Allan Poe. All God's children get Poe. Sooner or later, everybody gets the stories, and they still know them. If you say to somebody, it's why you can adapt the Telltale Heart on The Simpsons, and everybody knows what you're doing, or The Raven, and everybody knows what you're doing. Try that with Longfellow. Try that with Emerson. Try that with some other writer who was a contemporary to Poe. So I think Poe would be absolutely thrilled beyond words that his fame has outlasted and outlived all the people who were supposed to outlast and outlive him. On the other hand, I think he would be appalled that we've reduced his reputation down to a small group of stories. And basically, this has made him into primarily a horror master. His era, Stephen King, our grandfather of goth, whatever you want to call them. And secondarily, the father of the modern detective story. That's how we pretty much know Poe. And if anybody knows and recognizes Poe, that's how they would identify him. And we've done that. Again, when one of the lines that I just love hearing when I was writing the book, and somebody would ask me, what are you working on? And I'd say, I'm writing a biography of Edgar Allan Poe. Often enough, I would get somebody who would get all of a sudden this almost beatific look on their face. And I could almost say what they were going to say next. As soon as I saw the look, I could almost, my lips could move with them, because they said, oh, Edgar Allan Poe. I love Edgar Allan Poe. And here it comes. I've read everything he's ever written. And in the back of my mind, I never said it out loud. I never challenged it. But in the back of my mind, I was thinking, no, you haven't. You haven't even begun to read everything he wrote. Edgar Allan Poe only lived to be 40 years old. When one of the collected editions of his works was done in the early part of the 20th century, it numbered 17 volumes. And we have discovered quite a bit since then. So there's even more. So, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, really, you've read all 17 volumes of Poe's work, and that much of it is what might be described as horror. That much of it is what's described. We don't read the rest. We don't continue to read the rest. People are shocked to learn that Poe wrote as much humor as he did horror. We don't read the humor today, And therefore, we're also surprised to learn that Poe had a sense of humor, because we'd think of him as a very gloomy, melancholy guy. And sometimes he was, but he also was a very engaging, very gentlemanly guy who had a very antic sense of humor. It even shows up in the horror stories if you're paying attention, because there's some of the horror stories like Cask of Amontillado, which is very funny. Cask of Amontillado is a very grim story. It's a revenge story, and it's a story of one man luring another to his death, and not just his death, but a very horrible death. He's going to roll him up in the catacombs, in the tombs underneath his house. And he keeps saying to the guy, it's a cat and mouse game. He keeps saying to the guy, let's go back. He keeps giving him a chance to escape. He keeps saying, no, let's go back. You are a man of importance. You will be missed. And the guy keeps insisting to go. He keeps playing to the guy's vanity and luring him deeper and deeper into the tomb, to his own death. And the fellow he's luring has a cough, and at one point he has a coughing fit, and he can't speak for a couple of minutes. And Montresor, the narrator, says, "We will go back. Your cough is too bad, and you are a man to be missed." And Fortunato says, enough. The cough is a mere nothing. I shall not die of a cough. And boy, and that's a laugh line in and of itself. But then Poe gives Montresor the line, true. And that one word is hilarious. My wife and I perform the Cask of Amontillado, and when we hit that true, the audience falls down laughing, because they know he's playing with him. And so Poe's even funny at his most grim moments sometimes, but we don't give him credit for any of that. And also, Poe lived in a time when we didn't have specialists. That didn't exist. Brand writers didn't exist. If you had said to Edgar Allan Poe, "Oh, you're a horror writer," he wouldn't have even known what you were talking about. You mean that I write Gothic stories? Well, yeah, I guess I do. Some of my stories are Gothic. But he wouldn't have ever considered himself anything more than just a writer. And he would have said, well, today, yes, I'm writing, the mood has taken me and I am writing a scary story. But tomorrow, I'm writing a detective story. The next day, I'm writing a satire. The next day, I'm writing criticism. The next I'm writing an essay. Poe was certainly, as I said before about the Vincent Price line about the man who limits his interests, limits his life. Poe did not limit his interests. Poe was interested in everything. He was interested in science, and not just science, but all the sciences. He was such a brilliant thinker that one of his pieces actually prefigures modern physics. He was interested in rocks. He was interested in flowers. He was interested in languages. He was interested in travel. He was interested in history. He was just interested in everything. And all of that is what made him so good at the horror stories. There is a reason we still read that little group of stories. He was better at it than anybody else. And those horror stories were a very popular staple of the magazines at the time. They had been from the early, like around 1815 on. The magazines knew that the audience loved good spooky stories, and they tended to be very much on the lurid side. And here comes Poe, and as Ray Bradbury said, Poe takes the horror story and he makes literature of it. And you can't go past that too fast. You can't just drive by that and say, yeah, that sounds good. Stop! Poe took the horror story and he made literature out of it. He's not alone. Mary Shelley precedes him with Frankenstein and certainly has a hand in this. Robert Louis Stevenson's right after him, and he has a hand in this, and Bram Stoker follows them. The four of them are sort of the Mount Rushmore of people who made literature out of horror in the 1800s. And not one of them would have considered themselves a horror writer, because they would have just said, well, that just happens to be where I am today. Branding, that's a 20th century American conceit. American culture decided, what kind of writer are you? What kind of director are you? Oh, Hitchcock does thrillers. John Carpenter does horror movies. Wes Craven does horror movies. Billy Wilder does comedies. You didn't have to choose in Poe's time. You didn't have to limit yourself that way. So yes, Poe is misunderstood. One of the reasons I wrote the book is that I wanted to give a picture of who the real Edgar Allan Poe was, and not this kind of cartoonish stereotype that we've made of him, which goes with that branding and which goes with what the pop culture has done. And this really kind of starts in the 1930s. It really starts from the moment that Universal makes their Poe movies, quote Poe movies, because they don't. The Black Cat and the Raven, particularly with Karloff and Lugosi, have very little to do with Poe, and a lot of the Roger Corman films in the '60s have very little to do with Poe. But they sort of cement the idea that Poe is the horror guy, Poe's the spooky guy. So we and with that, we've also created a stereotype of who he was, because it's great that we say Edgar Allan Poe and everybody gets an image of who this is. And the image is largely based and fed on the fact that there are only about 8 known photographs of Edgar Allan Poe. And all of them come from the last 6 years of his life. So he lives to be 40. And we have 8 pictures of him. They all come from the last, about 6 years of his life. So we have no idea of what he looked like for the majority of his life. And almost all of the watercolors of him, what we think of are good portraits of him, they also come from the last 6 years of his life. And so we also have created this stereotype based on this gloomy guy in the pictures who doesn't smile. One of the reasons he doesn't smile was nobody smiled when they had their picture taken back then.
Right. I have an old wedding picture where they look like they are the most unhappy people in the world.
When they were called daguerreotypes, and when you went into a studio to have a daguerreotype made of you sat in a very uncomfortable chair. You sat upright. The chair had braces in it, which would go in the back of your neck and around you to hold you in one position. And the photographer would tell you, don't smile, because it's hard to hold a smile. It's easier to look serious. So if you look back at any of the statesmen or anybody who had their picture taken in the 1840s, nobody's smiling. So we have this record of Poe, and most of the pictures come from the last 2 years of his life. He didn't even grow the mustache until the last couple of years of his life. And we also see a guy who's beginning to fall apart physically. We see the last 2 years of a 40-year life. We see him at basically age 38, 39. And something's going wrong at this point. But that feeds the stereotype of the gloomy guy. So I say Edgar Allan Poe. Most people got an image of a guy sickly, pale-skinned, hollow-eyed, and then if you went further with the stereotype, sitting up in an attic, surrounded by cobwebs and dust and
some ravens.
A raven sitting on his shoulder, yes, a black cat, red-eyed black cat prowling through the dust while he has a quill pen in his hand, and he is firing off these fever dream stories, and probably fueled by alcohol and drugs. And none of that's true. None of that's true. Poe is a very careful artist and a very careful writer who constantly revised his work and wrote a great deal. Again, you can't live to be only 40 and write enough to fill 17 volumes, work at a very high quality in a lot of different genres, and be under the influence of alcohol all that time. Was alcohol a problem? Yes, of course it was. It wasn't the problem that most people think it was. As you know now from reading the book, Poe is probably allergic to alcohol. It took very little alcohol to make Poe roaring drunk. And that record is pretty consistent from his student days at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, when he takes his first drink, and all the way to the end. Poe was never one to savor a drink, to sip it. He charged the first one down, and then it was like he'd been drinking for hours. And then it took him forever, days, to recover from
days in bed.
Hangover. It wasn't just a morning hangover for Poe. Yeah. It was days. So alcohol had a devastating effect on his system. And he always took the pick the wrong time to take a drink. That's the other thing about Poe. Poe is always going to do the right, wrong thing at the exact wrong time. We know that's the way he is. So picks the wrong time to pick a fight. He selects the wrong time to alienate somebody who's going to do something good for him. He takes the wrong time to take a drink. And then that's what people remember. But there are these long periods, 12, 14 months when he's not drinking at all, when there are these long moments of periods of sobriety. And it's during those times he's producing all of this incredible work and working at it very hard. So if you buy into the stereotype of Poe, if you buy into the caricature, you're undercutting him as an artist. You're not accepting who the real Edgar Allan Poe was who created those works. And there's no evidence at all that he ever took drugs, except the drugs that everybody took when doctors prescribed them, because laudanum was prescribed for everything back then. And
Right.
you're lucky that the laudanum didn't kill you for whatever it was prescribed for trying to cure. So there's no evidence at all that Poe ever took drugs. Even his worst enemies did not claim that. So these are all the stereotypes which have clung to Poe over the years. And, for most of Poe's life, he was healthy. He was healthy, athletic. You don't think of Poe as athletic, but he was. He was a good boxer. He could win any jumping or long leaping contests. He loved to laugh. We just don't have any pictures of him. If we had one picture of him laughing, how would it change our image of Edgar Allan Poe?
Right. Yeah, and you wonder because, like you said, I mean, I remember when I first read The Black Cat, and I'm pretty sure that's the first one I read. Like you said, in 7th grade, we got a bunch of them, but at the same time, you're getting, The Old Man and the Sea, you get Gatsby, you get Huck Finn, and all those. But for some reason, Poe just continues kind of over all those other authors, even over Twain.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Perhaps some of it is the dying, obviously young or youngish, but it's kind of in the vein of like the Billy the Kid or James Dean, where we've kind of romanticized these characters because we know so little about it. And especially in Poe's case, where his death is very unusual. Here's missing time, and so it leaves the mind. I mean, obviously, we know kind of your track on it. I don't want to spoil.
It's all right.
Much.
I mean, it's true. I mean, the death is, that's why the subtitle is reversed, and it's the death and life of Edgar Allan Poe. Now, most biographies would be the reverse of that, but one of the reasons that those are reversed is because we have reversed that too. We start to think discussions about Edgar Allan Poe don't start at the logical point where most biographies start, which is where somebody is born. It starts with this discussion of his death and how he died, and it certainly has propelled his fame and interest in him and fascination with him. And it's not just because he dies under mysterious circumstances. It's not just because it's an unsolved case. It's also because his death reflects his two greatest literary achievements. That's the important thing, is Poe dies under circumstances which would not be out of place in one of his own horror tales. It's certainly a lingering, terrible death in that hospital in Baltimore. And then he also dies on leaving us a mystery, and not just a mystery, but a double-barreled mystery, because there's not only the mystery of what did he die of at 40, but there's also the mystery of the missing days before he was found on the streets of Baltimore, insensible and wearing clothes that were not his own. He gets on a steamer in Richmond, heading for Baltimore after spending the summer in Richmond. From the moment he steps foot on that steamer to when he's discovered in front of an election polling place in Baltimore, those days are completely hidden from view. No witness has ever stepped forward at any point to say so much as I passed him on the street, or I had a conversation with him at the railing of the steamer. Anything, nothing. These days are not just mysterious and up for grabs, they're completely hidden from our view. So Poe leaves us with a double-barrel mystery, the father of the detective story. Well, that's just the greatest stage exit in literary history. That's, as one Poe scholar said, it's almost like a PR agent went to him and said, Eddie, the best thing that you could do is die at 40 and die under circumstances which are going to be right in tune with your horror and your mystery stories. And it's true. It's that there are some great literary stage exits in history. Moliere was a great literary stage exit. He's a playwright and he's an actor, and he's dying of tuberculosis, and his latest play is being premiered. And as he's dying, he's trying to get through the premiere of his latest play. He collapses on stage. People think he's dead. They drag him into the wings. They revive him. He goes back. He finishes the play, and then he goes home and he dies. Well, that is a great, great literary stage exit for a writer who is also an actor. And then there's Twain, who, having been born in November of 1835 with Halley's Comet in the night sky, correctly predicts he will die when the comet comes back in April of 1910. And it's Babe Ruth pointing to where he's going to hit the home run. It's a called shot. He does it. He pulls it off. That's an amazing literary stage. But in many ways, Poe outdoes them all with this, because he dies under circumstances which are reflective of his writing. And that is amazing. That's an amazing thing. So yes, that is. But the other reason I reversed the subtitle is that although we don't know how Poe died, and we'll probably never know for certain how he died, we do know one thing for sure, and that is he stopped drawing breath on Sunday, October 7th, 1849. We know he's buried the next day, October 8th, in a small Presbyterian cemetery in Baltimore on a chilly, windy, rainy day, miserable day, a miserable ceremony attended by almost no one. And then we also know that the next day, October 9th, he's buried again, because a person who he thought was a friend, Rufus Griswold. Isn't that a great name for a villain, Rufus Griswold? You can hardly say that name without wanting to yes and boo. It's like you expect that to be a melodramatic, Victorian villain in the corner. Rufus Griswold. He writes this obituary of Poe, and the obituary starts with the words, I'm paraphrasing, but it starts with words like, Edgar Allan Poe died the day before yesterday in Baltimore. Some will be surprised, but few will be grieved. And it goes downhill from there. And what Poe did not know was that Griswold, who fancied himself as the arbiter of literary taste in America, had been working up grudges against Poe, and he did not wait until the body was cold. He launches his attack immediately, and the damage that Griswold did to Poe's reputation extends to this very day. He does everything in his power to depict Poe as immoral, as a degenerate, as just a terrible person. And he's not done. He's going to revisit this. Griswold, for the next few years, is obsessively flailing at the corpse in his jealousy of Poe and his hatred for Poe. And there's a backlash to it, but Poe is buried a second time under this mountain of lies and misinformation. And then in 1875, they buried him again because they dug him up. They wanted to put a nice monument over his grave. And where he was buried in that Baltimore cemetery, it was too small for the cemetery, for the monument. So they moved him into the front of the cemetery and put the monument up. So he's buried again, Now, so this guy just keeps getting buried. But if you know anything about an Edgar Allan Poe short stories or his poems, you know one thing, and that is nothing stays buried in an Edgar Allan Poe short story. And sure enough, Poe emerges from the grave to blast away his enemies and become the most read, most recognized American author, not only in his own country, but around the world. And it's amazing. I mean, and that's why it's the death and life of Edgar Allan Poe, because this guy's life is so interesting, but his afterlife is interesting too, because he is going to defeat the grave in a way and defeat all these attempts to bury him. And he ain't going to stay buried. He's going to come back and just bigger and better each time. So that's the reason the subtitle is reversed. And yes, certainly the mysterious circumstances of his death have fueled our interest in his life. And I certainly wanted to use that mystery as the filter for examining his life, because I was much more interested in how Poe lived and who the real Edgar Allan Poe was than I was in this ongoing mystery of how he died.
Right. Well, and how many, writers get a modern movie? I mean, 2012, where they're the main character and almost a Sherlock Holmes type of person, right? I mean, even though he kind of invented that, right? But I mean, John Cusack gets to play him in the 2012 film The Raven. Now, how do you feel about John Cusack as Mr. Poe?
What's the stereotype? I mean,
Mhm.
it's nothing but the stereotype. It's that's all based on that. And I'm not saying that even to make it sound judgmental or anything. It's just observational. Because look, we're all guilty of it. I'm guilty of it. We love that Poe. We love the Poe who is the stereotype, the father of the macabre. I love it. You and was that part of who he was? Yes, that was part of who he was. Was he drawn to the death culture of the time, of the 1820s and 1830s? Absolutely. Did he have a melancholy streak? Yes. Did he play up the romantic guy dressed in black? Yes. Lord Byron was his hero, and yes, he did. He even played into his when he finally gets a little bit of fame when The Raven is published in 1845, and it becomes a sensation, and finally he gets this little bit of celebrity because of this, and he became known as the Raven Man. He loves it. He plays up to it. He goes out and the neighborhood children follow him, and they start throwing pebbles at his heel, and he waits till they creep up and get brave enough to come just close enough, and he wheels around and he says nevermore, and they all go up screaming, and he love it. He's playing up to it, so like Stephen King would do today. So, was this a part of who he is? Yeah. Do we love that part of who he is? Yes. But you miss out on you're just looking at him through this one little filter, and you're missing out on who the whole person was when you do that. And so that movie takes that one aspect of Poe and says this is who Poe was. But no, that wasn't who he was. We have a more recent effort with The Pale Blue Eye, which is set around his days at West Point, which gets a little bit closer to who the real Poe was. But again, there have been four major documentaries done on Poe uh, since around 1990 for American Masters. PBS has done it a couple times. The old A&E channel took a swing at it, and they all say the same thing, which was Edgar Allan Poe is not who you think you were, and then they all go back to the stereotype. Then they all, but the master of the macabre, that's they all go back to it, and I guess I said, we're guilty of it too. As my wife and I do an evening with Edgar Allan Poe with our larger literary theater company, and we've been doing this many years, and we do a selection of Poe's stories and poems, and we always open by saying Edgar Allan Poe's collected works fill more than 17 volumes, and they do this, and this. He was this amazing writer. But tonight we're doing The Raven. Tonight we're going to give you the Cask of Amontillado. We do it the same thing. We do the exact same thing. So we love that. I think the problem with all of this is if you go back to 1960, let's say you go back in time to the dawn of that amazing decade when everything seems to be turned inside out and upside down and everybody's questioning their place in the world, when everything changes, music changes, everything changes. If you go back to that point, you stand at the precipice of the 1960s. There are two American authors who are universally recognized around the world, not just their works, and not just their name, but their faces, and that's Edgar Allan Poe and Mark Twain. And both of their reputations at that time are based on stereotypes. For Twain, he is the grandfatherly man of letters. He is our avuncular, witty observer, boys author, family author, and that's who Mark Twain is. Poe is our master of the macabre and the father of the detective story. So this is who they are to people, and there are images in sort of black and white. Poe always in black, Twain always dressed in white. Oddly enough, Twain adopted the white suit in the last 2 years of his life, just as Poe grew the mustache in the last 2 years of his life. But if you look what happens in the 1960s, Twain's suppressed writings start to come out. All the things that his daughter didn't want the public to know about because she thought they would hurt his reputation. They did the exact opposite. They enhanced his reputation. And we started to see that that Twain was this great social critic, that he had these incredibly insightful things to say about religion and politics and the human animal and what he called the damned human race. And Twain gets bigger and bigger. He gets to be, we just expands throughout the 60s. And we don't lose that Twain. We don't lose the Twain we love, the witty guy, the family author. It's not like we lost that Twain because we accepted there was a lot more to him. But Poe comes out of the 60s the same guy he went in. He comes out of the 60s. Oh, he's still our master of the macabre, and he's the father of the detective story. And there's no expanding. And I think people are a little afraid that if we allow that an expansion of view of Poe, we'll somehow lose that. You're not going to lose that. He was too good at it. He was too terrific at it. You're never going to lose that Edgar Allan Poe any more than we lost that other Mark Twain. My problem with sort of the Hollywood view of Poe and the Hollywood treatment of Poe is that it has never gone past the stereotype. It has never gone past the caricature, and how much more interesting would it be if we saw Poe healthy, Poe who walked with a brisk military gait, upright. He was in the army. He was a good soldier. He got promoted to sergeant, then got into West Point. Was capable of great athletic feats, like swimming the James River against the current on a blisteringly hot day, and becoming a local champion in Richmond for it. A guy who could play a great practical joke on people. It could be very, very funny. If all of those things were allowed in, and we just allowed to say, yeah, this is why this guy was so good at what he did, not because he was this depressed, melancholy guy hanging around the cemetery all the time. Was Wes Craven that guy? If you got to know Wes Craven, you would have been astonished to find out that he looked and talked like an English professor, which is what he was before he turned to directing. If you got to know Vincent Price, if you got to know Robert Bloch or Stephen King, they're down-to-earth guys with great senses of humor. If they are all like that, doesn't it make sense that Poe must have been like that? And what you find out is, yeah, he was like that. Exactly, that's the case. We deny Poe the one thing he probably had to have had as a horror writer, and that's a sense of humor.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody who does horror has a great sense of humor. You need it. You need it to ground you. You need it to keep you sane. And Robert Bloch, the author of Psycho, in other words, Norman Bates' daddy, when I asked him about Poe, because Bloch had been pen pals with H.P. Lovecraft when he was a young man. And I asked him about Poe, and Bloch said, the problem is nobody thinks of Edgar Allan Poe as a guy whose mother-in-law called him Eddie. But once you view him that way, you will never see him the same way again. And that's who the real Edgar Allan Poe was. When you see the guy, who could play leapfrog in the front yard and split his pants and laugh himself silly in the process, once you see that guy, you'll never see that him as just that depressed, melancholy guy again. And that's why you undercut who the real human being is. To understand who wrote those stories, you have to understand the whole human being.
Mm. Yeah, no, most of the time people are very complicated, They're not just like, and I think too, one thing is people like the idea of a tortured artist, right? And so they see this caricature of Poe where he's all melancholy, death's always following him, he's always depressed, something like a Van Gogh, until you dig into him and you see he's playing pranks. And at the same time, I think it's a bit hard for people to let go of that romanticized version. We do a lot of stuff with Billy the Kid, and people have such an idea of who he is based on the Hollywood. It's hard to like accept the truth and like let it go, even though he's such a complicated person, and the real story is always better than the fictional one.
Right, exactly. And you know, and yet Hollywood is never happy until they have the stereotype. You know, they'll say
Mhm.
like, "Well, we want to do the real Edgar Allan Poe," and then they're never happy until it comes back to being the guy whose images that we market on T-shirts and socks and tea tins and all these things. I mean, which is the amazing thing about Poe is we do merchandise them. We merchandise them to an extent that no other author gets merchandised. Not even Shakespeare gets
Well,
merchandised the
he has
way
a football
Poe
team.
does. Well, you walk into uh, a Barnes and Noble or a BAM bookstore, and you will see shelves devoted to items Edgar Allan Poe. You
Mhm.
know, where are the shelves to Emerson? Where are the shelves to Longfellow? Where are these with shelves to other authors who are going to outlive Poe? Um, and if you look at Etsy and you look at do an account of how many items Poe items are for sale at Etsy, there are thousands upon thousands of items. And who's the second place author? Well, who cares? Because he's the second place author is so far off in the distance, you can't even see them. It's probably Shakespeare or Twain behind him, but who knows? Poe is just he's endlessly marketed. But what we market is still the stereotype. And
Mhm.
and again, the stereotype is fun. I understand it. I get it. You know, I, I've got a Poe action figure on my desk, just like a lot of people do. You know, they're Poe plushies. They're Poe. I mean, and I love this stuff as like everybody else. But I have no problem also accepting who the true artist was. You know, and one of the problems with what you're saying is that when Griswold's attacks, started to stick in people's throats, there was a counterattack. One was led by Poe's friends, and Poe had a lot of friends, and that's one of the things people are surprised at. But his friends led here in America led a bit of a counterattack against saying no, 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 this was not who the real Poe was. But the other major counterattack came from the French, led by Baudelaire and his disciples. But Baudelaire loved exactly what you were talking about, the tortured genius, the guy with a tinge of madness, and that this was where the genius came from. And Baudelaire encouraged people, and not just Baudelaire, his followers as well, to confuse Poe with his own characters, to basically view um, Poe's characters as reflections of himself. That Poe was in fact his own unreliable narrator. So he is the guy in the Telltale Heart. He is the guy in the Raven talking to the Raven. He is the guy in the Cask of Amontillado luring the guy to his death. Which again, under it's easy. It's easy. Yeah, I remember in high school teachers suggesting the same thing and teaching Poe that way. And it completely undercuts his genius, which is no, he was creating this stuff. He wasn't those people. He any more than Herman Melville was Ahab. No. Um, but if you do that, what the French were doing by lionizing him, they were also starting that stereotype. They were starting to enforce that the mad genius up in the attic stereotype. And that's not how he created. That's not how he created his art. It is, in fact, not how any horror writer creates his or her art. And you see this through and again. And it's one of the reasons I interviewed horror specialists for the book. It was an unorthodox choice by certainly doing interviews for a person for a biography of somebody who died in 1849. Doing interviews is a bit of an edgy thing to do and chancy thing to do, and I knew that when I was doing the book. The book is not an orthodox traditional biography of Poe. I did not think we needed another orthodox traditional biography of Poe. There are a lot of them, and there are a lot of good ones. I'm fans of those books. And it certainly is not an academic uh, biography of Poe. This is not an effort to write the standard academic biography of Poe. There are better people for that. At least there better be better people for that. And this is a working writer's biography of a working writer, which is what Poe was. So I'm not going to apologize for the type of writer I am. If you do not like this book and you do not like the stuff, that's fine. Nobody has to. Um, but I'm not going to try to be a type of writer I'm not. I'm not
Mm.
going to try to pretend I'm a writer that I'm not. I was a journalist for 43 years, and how journalists tell the story is to go out and do interviews. I also viewed this as sense of as being a detective on the case and examining his life and examining the details of his life and the details of his death. And what a detective does and a journalist does is they interview witnesses. So I went out and I found witnesses. Who are my witnesses? My witnesses are Poe scholars who have studied and examined minute detail various aspects of Poe's life and his writing. Forensic pathologists who perform autopsies every day. Forensic archaeologists who detectives, crime writers, true crime writers, an FBI agent, not just an FBI agent, but John Douglas, who is the creator of the profiling unit at the FBI, who agreed to talk to me about the case. Um,
Yeah, and
and
he's an interesting one because, like you said, he created how we like profile people.
yes, and and although John somewhat agrees with what I think my original premise going into the book was that it definitively cannot be solved. Um, he did observe something, offered something in talking about discussing Poe, which I had not thought of, which was that while we credit Poe with being the father of the modern detective story, in some cases the true crime story as well, and also writing works which would influence science fiction, certainly landmark horror stories, certainly landmark criticism as a literary critic. But John thought Poe should get credit for creating modern profiling, which I had never thought of, and I would have never claimed for Poe. But if the creator of the FBI's profiling unit says that you listen to it,
You
and
listen.
you conclude it in the book. So these were, and then I went to, and again I went to specialists in horror, writers, directors, actors, um, because they would understand what it would take to do this better than anybody else, even more than academics or professors who had studied Poe's writing from an academic standpoint. These are people who actually do it. So I
And some
went
of
to,
which are
yeah,
highly inspired, you
yeah,
know.
and so these were my witnesses. These were the voices throughout the book, and these were the people who I went to and asked, okay, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And again, that's an unorthodox way to write a biography, especially of somebody who died in 1849. The other thing that's non-traditional about the book is there is a dual timeline. There is uh, the chapters alternate between the last few months of Poe's life and then chapters looking at various aspects of Poe's life in chronological order until the two timelines meet at the end. I knew doing that there would be a significant number of people who would not like the fact that this book did not take the orthodox A to Z life approach of a biography. And I so if and if that does bother anybody, I always say, those two things, the fact that I approached this with the tools of a journalist or the documentarian, if you will, and then also as a working writer, and then the dual timeline. I always sort of put this up there like the Surgeon General's report on a pack of cigarettes and say, this book does this. If this is not what you're looking, if you're looking for something more traditional, be warned. This is not that type of book. Um, and if you object to that, I will fall back on something that Stephen King said, um, about his reputation as a horror writer, which is, Stephen King once said that if you object to the type of stories I write, all I can tell you is it is what I have. And that's what I would say about this book, is that this is the only way I could have written this book. It is what I have. And,
No, and I absolutely love it.
mhm.
You know, like you said at the beginning, there's so many just like kind of textbooky type of biographies. Not that they're bad, but there's so many of these that it's really nice to have like a fresh take on a story and one that's very unique. And like you said, yours is not trying to like change Poe, just build up more of the character that so many people have lost. Like go weave through the myths and show us more of the truth. One of which is his name, or how at least he went by. And as I was looking at your cover too, is Allan on the one side because you read it Edgar Poe, then Allan is kind
No,
of off to the side?
that's kind of reading a lot into.
It's reading more. See, I've already read too much into the cover.
No, and he did use Allan, by the way. He's just, and what the only known poem that his wife Virginia wrote is an acrostic, which the first line of each sentence of the stanza of the poem, if you go all the way down, spell out Edgar Allan Poe. His own wife did that. He did sign Edgar A. Poe, Edgar Poe, but he did. There are instances when he used Edgar Allan Poe. There's not a. I think that some of that's been made a little bit too much of that. Oh, he never went by Edgar Allan Poe. Well, no, he did. It's not that he never went by Edgar Allan Poe. And again, in the early 1900s, there were a lot of biographies of Poe that came out before the first major biography of Poe that sort of started to correct the very twisted record, and that was the Arthur Hockman Quinn biography in around 1940 that comes out. There's a spate of biographies that come up right in the decades before that, which, lacking good information, went back on the old reliable Freudian interpretation of Poe's life, and a lot of it's just nonsense, just utter nonsense. And they would read little things into it. So I think the way to say it is that I think everybody assumes he always went by Edgar Allan Poe, which is not true. Again, he if you look at a lot of his bylines, it's Edgar A. Poe, or whatever. But he used Edgar Allan Poe. He did, and that's. I think the temptation is to take his very tortured relationship with his foster father, John Allan, which is where the Allan comes from. And John Allan is another guy who emerges as a somewhat villainous character in Poe's life because he never formally adopts Poe. He always treats him as a charity case, always makes it known that he is the subject of his beneficence. And so a child who loses his mother when he's not yet 3 years old and desperately needs unconditional love of a parent and desperately needs approval and a sense of belonging is denied these things by this very austere foster father, and their relationship becomes more contentious the older Poe gets, until there's a break. And John Allan ends up leaving money in his will to illegitimate children, and he leaves nothing to Poe. Absolutely not a penny to Poe. So I think there's a tendency to sort of look at the Freudian interpretation of this and the father figure and the tortured, the need for this, and say, oh, he never used the Allan part. No, that's not exactly true, because I think you could reverse that and do Freudian analysis on this too, and say, well, but Poe also had pretensions to the Virginia aristocracy. He was raised in this prominent Richmond family. He certainly, his view of himself was that he was heading for a membership in the Virginia aristocracy. And if you take that, then the Allan might have, to him, represented that. That might have been so. You could argue it both ways. The only thing that in a sort of course correction is to say he didn't always go by that name. He did not always, and even E.A. Poe sometimes. So.
Yeah, and like you said, with the ties with Virginia and stuff, how do you think he, like, this is hard because it's always like, what if, but I mean, do you think he gets viewed differently if he lives a little bit longer? and like everything that happens with the U.S. happens.
And I would resist that question. I don't like kind of the, would Spartacus have won if he had a Piper Cub argument? I think, you do kind of get into the what if arguments in there. And it's hard. It's like, if Poe had lived another 10, 12 years to the dawn of the Civil War, there's one, well, he would have been a Confederate. He would have, Virginia was the state of his heart, and Richmond was the city of his heart. And he was anti-abolitionist. He was certainly had the white supremacist view of most adult white males in America at that time, North and South. So there's this kind of immediate assumption that, oh, he would have joined the Confederacy and been a Virginia. But he was also, his politics were conservative. He was a Whig, which becomes the Republican Party in the next few years. So this is another one that can be argued both ways. And from 1838 on until his death in 1849, he lives in northern cities. And from 1838, he's living in Philadelphia and New York, which is about as northern as you
could get at the time.
Yeah. So he somewhat views himself as a citizen of the world at this point. So it's an easy assumption to sort of say, well, if Poe had lived, we don't know. We don't know what changes would have come from him. He dies at 40. And I think what's kind of interesting about your question is we don't really ponder this one that much. It's unlike a lot of people who die, like James Dean. There's always this kind of, well, what roles would Dean have gone on to? What kind of actor would Dean have turned into? Well, we don't know. He dies with 3 starring movies, and that's it. It's just like, we do know what Paul Newman did with those years. We know what Marlon Brando did with given the added years. We don't know what Dean would have done. But we do wonder, and we wonder with a lot of careers cut short. F. Scott Fitzgerald dies at 44. Flannery O'Connor dies in her early 40s. Anton Chekhov and Robert Louis Stevenson die at 44. Jack London dies at 40. You have this whole group of people who die in that 40 to 45 range. And almost always there's the question of, what masterpieces would they have given us? What would they have gone on to do? We don't ask that question of Poe that much. And I think one of the reasons is, even though he only lives to be 40, there is a sense from a literary standpoint that it's a complete life. That he did what he was meant to do, that he wrote what he was meant to write, and that he accomplished what he was meant to accomplish. There is kind of a full circle sense to his life, that for somebody who only lives to be 40, we should ask that question. We should say, what would Poe have done? But we don't. There's not that kind of pondering, and maybe because what he did was so incredible, which is one of the reasons I wanted to sort of really dig into Poe's technique and his approach to his art, because which really fascinates me. The writing process fascinates me. And I think one of the reasons that I always come back to this with Poe is Poe's a genius. There's no getting around this, that Poe is a genius, and he knew he was a genius. One of the things that makes him so lonely and isolated is he knew not only that he was better than all the people who were getting celebrated and lauded, he knew why he was better than they were. And this really creates the sense of isolation for him. And he was right. If you look back at Poe's literary judgments, he's right. The people he basically says deserved to live have lived, and the people he thought were just trash have faded away from view. So, and even in his own creation, one of my favorite stories about Poe is after he finishes The Raven. He starts The Raven in Philadelphia, and then he finishes it in New York. And right after he finishes it, he goes for a walk, and he encounters a young friend. And the young friend says, "How are you?" And Poe says, "I've just completed the greatest poem anybody's ever written." And the friend is like, "Oh, that's nice. Well, that's nice." And he said, No, you don't understand. I have just completed the greatest poem ever written. And he recites This may be the first performance of the Raven. For an audience of one. He recites it to this friend on the streets of New York. And Poe gets done, and the friend says, "Well, that is fine." And Poe says, "Fine, fine. That's all you can say. This is the greatest poem ever written." He knew. He knew. Now, I don't know about anybody. I can't speak for any other writer, but most writers I know, when they finish something and somebody says, "How does it come out?" the immediate thought is, "I don't know." Every writer has doubt, self-doubt, imposter syndrome. We all suffer from a myriad of things which make you second guess what you've done and doubt what you've done. Here's Poe finishing the Raven, and he knows how good it is. He knows what he's done. That's Mozart. That's not just another writer. That's not another American writer. That's Mozart, and that's why Poe is Poe. He's a genius, and you see this in his other writing too. You see this in the writing that nobody else reads. The criticism's wonderful, and I think that's another thing that people are always surprised to learn, that in Poe's lifetime, he was not best known for his horror stories in his own country. In his own time, he was best known as a literary critic. He was best known as the literary critic who was calling for a true American literature. That he looked around and he saw literature which was on its knees, bowing primarily to Europe and specifically to England. And he thought American literature was never going to become its own until it created its own voice. And so his criticism was very severe and very exacting. And he made a lot of enemies because of it, but it's very good. He's sort of our John the Baptist out there in the wilderness calling for an American literature. He's both calling for it and fulfilling it at the same time. That's pretty amazing right there. So, this is why the real Poe needs to be
talked about,
celebrated, not just talked about and recognized, but celebrated as well, more fully celebrated, because he becomes more amazing. Somebody asked me the other day what surprised me writing the book, and I said nothing really surprised me, but everything I knew about Poe went up. Everything I knew about him was heightened, and it's like, it's not just, oh, he wasn't just good, he was a genius. Oh, he wasn't just good at this, he was really good at this. So that is the thing which really has increased my. I'm not trying to make a saint of him. Listen, Poe had so many character traits which probably would have driven me right up the wall. Somebody asked me a while ago, knowing that 5 of my books are about Mark Twain. They said, if you could have dinner with either Mark Twain or Edgar Allan Poe, who would you have dinner with? Are you kidding? Mark Twain, not even close. It's going to be fun. We're going to have cigars. We're going to have scotch. We're going to have a great dinner. We're going to have laughs. It's going to be fun. I would have liked to have been Poe's friend. I really would have liked to have helped him in some ways. But I think Poe is the very definition of high maintenance. One Poe scholar said that if you had lived in Philadelphia at the time that Poe lived there, and you had a little peephole in the door, and there was a knock on the door, and you could look at the people and see it was Poe, you might not answer the door. You might say, I can't take it today. That's Poe is, again, I don't want to make a saint of him. There's a lot of things that just exasperate you about Edgar Allan Poe. There are a lot of times in his life where you just want to reach into the pages of the biography and slap him and say, no, not now. Now
don't drink now.
Don't piss this guy off. This guy's trying to help you. Don't take a drink now. Your dream is on the verge of happening, and you're going to undo everything. Poe wrote a story called The Imp of the Perverse, and it's about this becoming obsessed with doing something, and you have to do it after a while. You have to give in to the impulse of it. Poe had the imp of the perverse. And this is something which runs out through his life. So while I wrote this book, I won't say I don't like him, but I'm not capable of writing a full biography and spending that much time on a biography of somebody who I don't like. I don't want to spend that much time in a company with somebody I don't like. Well, somebody said, well, do you like? I said, yes, I like Poe, and I feel sorry for him, and I want his life to have been better. I want his life to have been. I mean, he lived in poverty most of he's the first American writer who actually tries to make his living solely through the talent of being a writer, a critic, and an editor. And most writers in the 1800s had day jobs. They worked at universities, they worked in local parishes, they had government jobs. Very few writers made enough there were no copyright laws. You got paid something right up front, a few bucks, and then everybody would steal it, and there was nothing stopping them. So Poe made very little money off of what he wrote, shockingly little, for his genius. And I think that's one thing that's admirable about Poe too, is he never gives up. He's constantly trying to start his own magazine. And that's the dream of his life. One of the dreams of his life is to create his own magazine and be the editor and chief contributor to his own magazine. And in the last year, it seems that might come true. That's one of the things. It's within his grasp there at the very end.
No, I was thinking when you were telling the story of his friend, just some 140, 50 years later, an American city votes to have his poem as their football mascot.
Right? Yes. What other team is named for a literary reference? It just, like everybody wants Poe playing on their team, not just naming the team for them, but everybody, horror people want Poe, science fiction people want Poe, the mystery people want Poe, the critics should want Poe because he was a great critic.
Cities want to claim him.
And we've got 5 cities who he have a claim on Poe, and they have a competition among them because he's born in Boston in 1809. He grows up in Richmond, which in many ways remains the city of his heart. He finds the family that he so desperately needs in Baltimore in the 1830s, and then he dies there. He does his greatest writing in Philadelphia. The 6 years he's in Philadelphia, those are the golden years, from 1838 to 1844. This is where he writes most of the short stories that we know him for. And then he's living and dies living in New York. At the time that he dies, he's living in a cottage in what is now the Bronx near Fordham. So these 5 cities all have a claim on Edgar Allan Poe, and there's kind of a friendly rivalry among the 5 cities. And Baltimore, in some ways, is one before it starts, because Baltimore has so embraced Poe and is so. Again, the football team alone, it would be enough, but. There's only 3 houses standing where Poe lived, and one of them's in Baltimore. So that's a museum to Poe. So they have the grave, they have the statue to Poe downtown, they have the house, and as the people in Baltimore like to say, we've got the body, we win. So there's that part of it as well. But all the other cities have a legitimate claim on Poe. Philadelphia, he lived in 5 different houses in Philadelphia. Only the last one is still standing, and it is maintained by the National Park Service. It's where he wrote The Black Cat, by the way. And the basement of that house, you can go down the stairs in the basement of that house and go, yeah, this is the Black Cat, all right. So, and he writes all of his best stuff there. We don't associate Philadelphia with Poe, but in some ways we should, because there was a Poe scholar. I encouraged all of the Poe scholars I talked to speak as candidly and conversationally as they could, because I didn't want them to talk in academic speak. I wanted them to say things just as they would say them. And one of the scholars in Philadelphia, in making the case for Philadelphia, said, look, when you go into the Baseball Hall of Fame, you go in under the jersey for the team with which you put up your big numbers. Poe put up his big numbers here in Philadelphia. It's a great way to put it. Great way to put it. He said, but all of his hits are here. He's heading for average here. And he's right. He's right. The 6 years in Philadelphia are where the majority of the great stories are written. But again, all of the cities have a wonderful claim on Poe.
Talking about myths and stuff like that, like you said, there's a lot of stuff right after he dies that he's like this drunk and on drugs and stuff. but a lot of people forget the time of his in the Temperance, as well as if he's coming back and re-editing and just retooling his play so many times. I don't think someone could just be drunk, you know?
No, it's impossible.
Yeah.
And again, and they're witnesses. I mean, there were people actually around Poe, living with Poe, who can testify, who did testify to the fact that he has these long periods of sobriety where he's not touching them. It's just, again, inevitably he is going to take a drink, and it is going to have a devastating effect on his system. It's sort of like the way I looked at the death. We're up to about 26 theories on how Poe died. And one of the things I did, again, as a sort of a detective on the case, was to say, okay, what if we treated each of these systems as a suspect? Treated each one of them as one of the things which could have killed Poe. So they're all suspects. How many of these suspects can we eliminate through investigation and common sense? And quite a few we actually can. We can make a pretty good case for eliminating several of the standing theories as to how Poe died. And then we look at this as a detective, and say, okay, who are the people of the person of interest? Who do we continue to have back in the interrogation room again and again, who had the most means and opportunity? And this comes down to a much smaller group. And then also say, okay, and who are our primary accomplices? Well, one of the accomplices has got to be alcohol, because we know this devastates his system and probably weakened it. So whatever killed Poe, alcohol probably did play a role in it. Poverty probably played a role in it too, because it created a lot of stress in his life. A lot of times when food is short and he's living under conditions which are not the best. So poverty is probably always going to be an accomplice in all this, and alcohol is probably always going to be an accomplice.
Yeah, and there's been so many theories, like you said. A lot of time I think people kind of look at his clothing as perhaps what happened. Um,
the theory of the missing days, and I certainly don't mind discussing that, because that theory is not mine, and that research has been out there for a long time. But one of the explanations as to the missing days is that Poe was cooped. Now, cooping was a 19th century art form, which was a couple of cities had refined to a fine art, and Baltimore was one. Baltimore was a rough town in the 1840s, 1830s, 1840s. Any American East Coast town that had a harbor would have had a rough neighborhood. And Baltimore certainly had that. But even by those standards, Baltimore was a tough town. Baltimore's nickname was Mob Town. And one of the reasons their nickname was Mob Town is because they would riot at the drop of a hat. And they took their rioting very, very seriously. When they rioted, they would drive the mayor and the sheriff out of town, and they would burn down the houses of leading citizens. And it would take days to restore order in Baltimore when they rioted. So, I mean, people look at riots today and think, oh, it's terrible. It's like, read your history. Go back and read your history. So if Poe had arrived in Baltimore at a time then when an election was going on, and he did, one of the theories is that he got shanghaied by a political gang. And when you got shanghaied by political gangs, you were taken from polling place to polling place, and you became a repeat voter. You would give a different name, and sometimes they would change your clothes, so you might not be recognized. And in between, you were kept in an area, a confined area, which became known as a pen or a coop. So this practice of being shanghaied became known as cooping. And this is a very good explanation for the missing days, or at least some of the missing days. Problem is, there's no proof. Nobody's ever come forward to say, yes, I saw Poe voting, or I was cooped with him. Nothing. It's just, again, all of a sudden he just shows up in front of this polling place, insensible and wearing the clothes that are in his own. So it's a very good explanation. I lean towards it myself. If somebody said, what's your theory as to where Poe was or what accounts for the missing days, I'd say certainly cooping probably did play a role. But I'm a proof guy. I like proof, and I'm not going to commit to that without some shred of proof. And the problem is there's no proof. It's not that there's little proof, there's no proof. It's a completely circumstantial argument. It's a good circumstantial argument because it fits Baltimore, it fits the time, and it certainly could have happened. So I don't think I've ever heard a better theory to to explain the missing days. But that doesn't mean that it's almost pat. It's almost too perfect. It fits Baltimore too well to sort of say it was cooping. But if push came to shove and you said, well, what do you think explain the missing days? I'd say, I'll go with cooping. Yeah, I'll go with that because I have never heard a better theory than that.
Right. Well, and like you said, it marks a lot of the check boxes that you want, and there is a ton of other theories. Be it, some people think he was just mad drunk, which doesn't really seem his character.
Had taken the temperance pledge
Yeah.
in Richmond after falling off the wagon a couple times that summer, and a couple of doctors who were friends examined him afterwards and basically told him, you can't keep doing this because it did have such a devastating effect on him. And they basically told him, you'll kill yourself. You'll be dead in a couple of years if you keep doing this. So Poe took the temperance pledge, and there's no evidence that he ever broke it. There's absolutely, and there were analysis done, two major analysis done on snips of his hair taken at the point of his death. Hair analysis will tell us what you ate and what you consumed and it's a very good record of the growth from where it was. So there's no evidence that he did take a drink from the hair analysis. So the burden of proof is on people who say that he was drinking during that period, not the other way around, because the evidence we do have suggests he wasn't drinking. Again, it doesn't rule it out. You can't prove a negative, and you can't say yes. Oh, he must have taken a drink, or he was given liquor when he was being cooped, which was possible. But once again, there's no proof. There's not any bit of proof that he was when he was taken inside the polling place. A friend of his was called for it, a Dr. Joseph Snodgrass, who was an old friend, who had seen Poe drunk. And he sees this guy in front of him, insensible, and he didn't do an examination. There was no blood alcohol test or anything kind like that. He just assumes Poe had been drinking. And then a relative by marriage shows up who also had seen Poe drunk. He jumps to the same conclusion. Snodgrass later goes on the lecture circuit as a temperance speaker. So it's in his best interest to tell people Poe had been drinking. If you're a temperance speaker, what better than to tell people that the great genius of Edgar Allan Poe was snuffed out by this demon alcohol? So it fit his narrative to say it. He had no proof. He had no evidence that Poe had actually been drinking. And the attending physician, John Moran, who although is unreliable in a lot of sense, Moran basically, as the attending physician who did examine Poe, said Poe hadn't been drinking. So again, the burden of proof is on anybody who wants to say that alcohol is what did it in those last few days. I sure would like to see something a little bit more hardcore than just the fact that Poe had incidents where he drank in the past.
Right. Well, and some of the other things people think is like, different family or soon to be family members came and beat him up, right? Or he had a brain tumor, and that's why.
That's the murder theory. Is that Elmira Royster Shelton's brothers tracked him down, and there's no proof.
There's no proof, because at least if you can't find Poe, you'd think you'd at least be able to find there.
Well, also, I mean, if he had been beaten, now remember, he's taken to Washington Academy Hospital. He is examined. If he had been beaten to the point that this would have caused his death, there would have been bruising that would have been noticed on the body. There would have been, and as unreliable a witness as Moran is, you think at one point he would have documented the fact that Poe had been beaten to within an inch of his life or something. It doesn't make much sense. That one doesn't. It's like the rabies theory, which became very popular several years ago. See, and one of the problems is Poe died, with which are called non-specific causes. If you die from non-specific causes, it means that the causes, it doesn't mean that the causes aren't specific in the sense that what there's observed. It means that they're not specific to a certain cause. In other words, there's a lot of different things that could have caused the same conditions. Everything we know that Poe died, the record as far as what Poe was like in those last few days, all of the symptoms that were recorded could have been caused by a staggering number of causes. And
Could have
that's
been
why
a
there's
lot
so
of
many,
different
yeah,
ones, yeah.
yeah, that's why there's so many theories. Any kind of what they call brain fever back then, it could have been caused by just a staggering number of possible causes. And that's one of the problems, is there's not a real one specific cause. Now, rabies, yes, can rabies cause a lot of the things that they saw in Poe? Yes, and that's why it became a popular theory. There's one problem with it. Poe undoubtedly took liquids at Washington Hospital. If he took one drink of water, it wasn't rabies. That's it. It's done. It's over, because you can't drink if you have rabies. You develop an aversion to water, and you actually will foam at the mouth at the very idea of drinking water. If Poe took one drink, and that certainly would have been remarked on if he wasn't taking liquids, it wasn't rabies. So it's one of the ones which I thought, well, how did this one ever get to the point where people took this one seriously? But it's there. It's one of the ones that constantly comes back as a possibility as to what. Also, if Poe had been contracted rabies, and his body was examined head to toe at Washington, if there was a bite wound, it would have been noticeable. So none of those things was commented on, and so I think rabies goes way, way down on the list.
Yeah, that one, when I was listening to some of your talks and reading and stuff, I was like, oh, I've never really heard the rabies one. So that one was interesting. But like you said, I don't put a lot of credence on that one. But, kind of like your book, we talk about his death. But now that you talk his death, you can introduce people to his life.
Exactly. And that's the whole, when this book came, the idea of this book was not mine. It was actually an editor at St. Martin's who came up with the idea for this book. Not because I wouldn't have been thrilled to have written a biography of Edgar Allan Poe. I just didn't have enough hubris to sort of present myself as the biography of Edgar Allan Poe. If I'm associated with any 19th century American author, it's Mark Twain. Can you tell? And not only because of performing Twain for more than 43 years with less makeup every year, but also because 5 of my books are Twain centric. And but you get to the point where when you write a book, if the book does well enough, when you sign a contract for that book, there's always a clause that gives the publisher the option to do your next book. In other words, if they publish your book and it was successful, this would say, well, for playing a role in that, if we should be given the option as to whether to publish your next book. Now, it doesn't mean they will publish your next book. It just means you have to give them the option on your next book. If they say no, then you're free to take it somewhere else. Well, I had done a book on the Twilight Zone for St. Martin's in 2017, and it had done well enough for us to have this discussion of what was the next book going to be. And I was having this discussion in 2019 with an editor at St. Martin's, and I hit him with what I thought was my best idea, my can't miss slam dunk idea. And the only problem is it missed. It missed badly. He did not like my can't miss idea. And so he did what editors often do. He counter-proposed with an idea that he thought might be good. And I didn't like his idea. So I hit him with my next best idea. He didn't like that either. And then he hit me with his next best idea, and I didn't like that. And we went back and forth for a while. And then we reached impasse. We reached the point where it's like we got to table this discussion for another day and come back at this fresh. And we were just about to get off the phone. He said the words, "What about Edgar Allan Poe?" And I said, "Well, what about him? What made you say that?" And sometimes it takes somebody else to state the obvious. And he said, "Well, it just seems that Poe checks a lot of your boxes." And it's like, "Well, how do you figure that?" And he said, "Well, Poe invented the modern horror story. You've written books about major horror topics like Dracula and the Night Stalker and such." And he said, "Poe invented the modern detective story. And one of your books is one about one of the great detectives of all time, the Columbo file." So, Poe was a critic most of his life. You were a critic most of your professional life. Um, you know, how does this not check all your boxes? You've written literary biography. You're associated with a major 19th century American author. This just seems to check a lot of your boxes. And I thought, yeah, I guess it does. I hadn't thought of it that way. But then it became a discussion of what kind of book. And it became clear very fast that he wanted a book that would solve definitively the mystery of Edgar Allan Poe's death. The kind of book that gets written every couple of years about Jack the Ripper that, shows up and says, "We have finally definitively solved the mystery of Jack the Ripper." And
Yeah, we
2
have the
years,
bloody apron.
right, and then 2 years later, there's going to be another book, and they'll put another candidate forward as to definitively solving who Jack the Ripper was. And I said, well, if that's the book you want, and you can't be dissuaded, then you'd better find yourself another lunatic because this one's driving away. I said, let me tell you why that book can't be written. There was no autopsy. And if there had been an autopsy, it would have been worthless because the state of the autopsy at that time was primitive. There were very few people who knew how to perform an autopsy. And if they had performed one, they would have been performing it with the equivalent of butcher's knives. The autopsy did not come into the modern era until the Civil War. The Civil War is the defining moment for autopsies because we got very good at cutting up bodies during the Civil War. There's a lot of opportunity. So I said, so there's no autopsy, there's no death certificate, there's no surviving soft tissue that can be subjected to modern forensics. There are no reliable witnesses. All the witnesses contradict not only each other, but even themselves. The attending physician, the one witness we need to be consistent in his observations about Poe, leaves behind 3 accounts of Poe's death, each of them wildly different in tone and details, to the point that he changes the time of death, to the point where he changes Poe's last words. That's pretty big things to change. And, if you got a guy like that on the witness stand and the opposing attorney said to him, we've got documents from you and you changed the time of death, I submit you are a completely unreliable witness that the jury should put no stock in. That would be a very powerful argument to make in front of a jury. So for all these reasons, I said, this book is a cold case you're talking about. I said, but the book I will write for you is I will take the mystery of Poe's death and use that as a prism to examine his life. And if I can come up with what I think is a compelling, convincing, strong case for what killed him, and it will be circumstantial. And circumstantial cases get taken to the jury all the time. I said, but if I come up with what I think I will present it. I will not go the next step and say I can prove it, and I will not insist on it. So do I come up with an answer in this book? Yes, I think, I come up with what I think killed Edgar Allan Poe. Do I insist on it? No. Do I say it can be solved, proved? No. And I'm not sure I would even want it to be definitively solved. I believe Edgar Allan Poe would have been the first to have said some mysteries are not meant to be solved. And we would certainly lose a lot if we did solve it definitively. There's a romantic aspect to Poe's death of not knowing that I'm not sure I would want to see ever completely shattered. So in that case, I'm in saying, I think I've got the right answer, but I would certainly not insist on it. I said, I don't have a dog in the fight that way. Somebody came up and say, I think you're wrong. I said, yeah, well, fine. Yeah, let's keep arguing about it. Let's keep discussing it and let's keep arguing about it, because that's one of the things that's going to keep Poe alive.
Hmm. Yeah, no, and I think too, like going back to like the medical practices, people sometimes get confused why an autopsy wasn't done, but it's like they take how we live today and forget how many years ago it was. I mean,
Yes.
even back in 1881,
And
some
death is
options.
much more common. Death is
Yeah,
all around you.
yeah.
And I mean, there's so many ways. I mean, Poe's mother only lives to be in her early 20s, and she was an actress. And being an
Mhm.
actor back in that time was a very, very hard life. You had to be very gifted, but also very gritty, and she was. Um, she could do comedy, tragedy, farce, Shakespeare. She could dance. She could sing. She learned hundreds of roles in this brief life, and she had to be able to do them at a moment's notice, because it's not like today where you would go into a theater, you'd set up your sets and everything, and you would do the same play every night for a week, maybe months. The theater going audience in the cities back then was not that large, so you had to offer a new play every night that you were in residence in a city, and then you were traveling from city to city, and something was raging in these places at some time every part of the year. Maybe it was cholera, maybe it was typhoid, maybe it was yellow fever, maybe it was something you could take you at any point, and you were living in these horrible hotels, and the theaters were rat infested traps. And it's not a long life. It's not a long life, and it takes an enormous amount of grit. And Poe inherits from his mother his creativity and his work ethic. These are the two great things he gets from his mother. And he's always proud of it. You have to remember that the theater is looked up of like one step above prostitution in cultured circles in that time. In many places, the theater's nickname was the legs of Satan. And for Poe, who aspired to be part of the Virginia aristocracy, it's one of the most admirable things about him is he never disowns his parents, who were both actors. He's the proud son of actors, and he says this all throughout his life. He even writes an essay in where he says that he's the proud son of actors, and that's pretty brave. That's a pretty brave thing to say, and it's pretty. He never disowns his heritage, and that's one of the more admirable things about Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah, no, and like you said, it's strange and kind of it's definitely the cleanliness is different. Even going to doctors, I mean, we know it's pretty. Some people might have a pretty good argument that the bullet didn't kill James A. Garfield, but the doctors did
Oh yeah, the
because
infection,
they didn't.
of
Yeah,
course.
they didn't sterilize and stuff like that, and
They've kept
so
probing and probing until they had just left him alone. He
he
certainly had a better chance
of
of,
living.
he might not have lived, but he certainly would have had a better chance of living
Yeah.
than that. I mean, and even at that, he lingered for quite a while. So, but yeah, I mean, and you're right. I mean, we people forget just not just that, but how prevalent death was. You know, infant mortality. You know, people talk about all the young women who die in Poe's poems and stories. Well, for one thing, Poe lost a lot of women who were important to him throughout his life. But so everybody did. You know,
Mhm.
the death rate in you know giving birth was staggeringly high. Doctors didn't wash their hands. Infection made its way in very very easily. So this whole idea that you know death was a lot more common, it gave rise in the 1820s, and this is kind of what's important to a sense that people don't see this with Poe, is in the 1820s and 1830s there is this what was called the death culture, and this is the beginning of these very ornate cemeteries and funeral practices that you know carry on to today. what a lot of people don't realize is the start of public parks start with cemeteries. The cemeteries were original parks. They would have lakes with ducks and geese and benches and rolling lawn, and people would have picnics. On the weekends they would have picnics in cemeteries when they would go and they would spruce up their loved ones' grave site, and that's where what we could now call Memorial Day was originally called Decoration Day, and it was where the whole nation would go and they would refurbish the cemeteries, and specifically the military did after the Civil War, and it became known as Decoration Day. So this is the start of this, and Poe is not immune to this. Poe is surrounded by this kind of death culture, and this is where the cemeteries start to get very ornate. You have these big tombs, and you have uh, these amazing architectural structures devoted to death. And Poe's not alone in this. He's not alone in you have these long periods of mourning and funeral rites and all of this which come in. And so Poe is writing at a time when all of America is sort of becoming more and more emotionally swept up in the death culture of the period. And Poe's stories tap into these kind of fears and these kinds of emotions more brilliantly than anything else that was written, to the point where they are as resonant today as they were back then.
Yeah.
That's not true of anybody else who was writing horror back then.
Yeah, and that death culture, like you said, grew really, really big. And maybe that's part of why a lot of people kind of stick to his poems like that. But I mean, especially after the Civil War, before, you see a lot of seances, and the spiritualist movement even get so as high as their seances, possibly in the White House during the Lincoln
Well,
administration.
not possibly. There were seances.
Yeah.
So we know that Mary Todd was trying to. They had lost two sons at that point, but particularly the death of Willie, uh, very much accelerated. There's no proof that Lincoln believed in the supernatural or seances, but the fact that he allowed them is and that allowed Mary's pursuit of this, then the possibility that they could contact their sons. He certainly was aware of it, and he certainly was, and certainly Lincoln probably believed in omens more than anything else. People who want to sort of look at Lincoln, they're very complex, obviously, and it's too simplistic to say, well, this, therefore that with Lincoln. But Lincoln's favorite author was Shakespeare, and so Shakespeare's plays are just filled with omens, and certainly throughout the Civil War, and even with his own fate, Lincoln believed in omens and put a great deal of stock in that. So, but yes, you do have the rise of the seance, and that's goes into hyperdrive because of the losses of the Civil War, which are just beyond staggering.
Yeah, I mean, we can't imagine, there's even in movies, I think they sanitize.
Oh,
I mean, obviously they
whole,
have to,
whole,
but
whole towns
mm,
lost their young men, lost their young population, in the Civil War. There are whole towns where no young men came back because they all were in the same infantry regiment, and that regiment got wiped out at Shiloh or got wiped out at Antietam, and so it's staggering how many you know there's if I live in Ohio. Ohio sent 300,000 soldiers into the Union Army. Only New York and Pennsylvania sent more than that. The death toll for a soldier from Ohio was 30,000. So just start with that. You had a 1 in 10 chance you weren't coming back. You take 10 young people from Ohio, one of them ain't coming back. It's an enormous number. As far as death touching people, and it was concentrated in some areas in certain cities and towns because all of those people might have gone into one unit, and that unit might have had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So, yeah, the Civil War is it, it is still. I mean, we're still fighting the Civil War. We're still, the truth. My wife and I do a show called Shades of Blue and Gray: Ghosts of the Civil War, where we talk about the ghost stories. We start in Ohio, and we do thing. And there were two major prisoner of war camps in Ohio: Camp Chase in Columbus and Johnson's Island up near Sandusky. And there are a lot of ghost stories connected to both those cemeteries. It's a very popular show for us because you get a lot of we do a lot of history. We do a lot of local history. My wife has a beautiful singing voice. Sarah's just a wonderful singer, so she does songs from that period. We do a little bit of humor. We do literary selections like poems by Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman, and we end up with a selection of ghost stories about sightings of Lincoln at the White House. Lincoln's known as just the White House ghost. So there's a lot of bang for the buck. You don't have to be into ghost stories for this, because you're going to get a lot of history. You're going to get a lot of literary selections and everything else. But with this come the ghost stories, and that's why we did it. We, in our research, are just they're everywhere. The ghost stories connected to the Civil War are just everywhere, and this show has become our most popular, I think, because of not only this ongoing fascination with this, but because again, we are still dealing with the legacy of the Civil War. No, it isn't. It is not. It's not over in a lot of ways. So, it's in many ways our most popular show.
Yeah, no, that sounds very fascinating. And you talk about local history. I mean, have you dug a lot into? I mean, because Ohio is pretty big for presidents. I mean, there was a pretty good stretch of Ohio presidents. Of course,
Well,
two of them get assassinated.
we live within easy driving distance of McKinley and Garfield's tombs.
Okay.
And I've been to the burial sites of all the assassinated presidents. I lived in Washington D.C. for 5 years, so I was out in Arlington quite a bit, and I seen the eternal flame for JFK. I know, been to Springfield, seen where Lincoln is buried. To the south of us is Canton, where McKinley is buried. It's a very impressive marble monument, very austere, very big. But in some ways, the Garfield monument beats them all. If you're ever in Northeast Ohio, get yourself over to Lakeview Cemetery and see the Garfield monument. Garfield died at the height of the Gilded Age and also the height of the death culture. I've never seen anything like this. The Garfield monument is a freestanding 3-story monument in the middle of Lakeview Cemetery. John D. Rockefeller is buried in Lakeview Cemetery. Mark Hanna, the political boss, John Hay, who was Secretary of State for Theodore Roosevelt and Lincoln's private secretary, is in Lakeview Cemetery. They all just paupers compared to Garfield. You walk into this incredible monument, and every country and every state sent something: stained glass, marble, gold, everything. It's staggering. You walk in and there's this marble statue of Garfield standing there, bathed in white, surrounded by stained glass. You can go upstairs. There's a walk around inside, and then there's a walk around outside the monument. And then you go downstairs, down circular steps, down to the crypt where the coffins are out. Garfield and his wife, they're encased in copper, and they're flag draped, but the coffins are behind this. It's like something out of a Vincent Price movie from the 1960s. It's just incredible. But you could put where Lincoln is buried and where McKinley is buried and where Kennedy is buried. You could put them all together and multiply them by 10, and you still wouldn't have the Garfield monument. I just encourage anybody. And anyway, this is like, because people forget, if you don't live here and know about Garfield's legacy, people don't really know that much about that. He's just one of those presidents who's between Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt for most people, and they all had funny names like Chester and Grover, and everybody gets them all kind of together. So they see this like Garfield. Wasn't he a cat? What was Garfield? What is this? And you see this monument. It really is impressive, and Garfield really is an interesting guy, by the way. I'm not trying to in any way shortchange him. And in Northern Ohio, he's very well known, but people are just stunned that there's this kind of thing exists to Garfield. So, if you ever make it here, Lakeview Cemetery.
It's definitely on my my to-do list, because I read a book where it's like Garfield is our biggest what if president. I mean, we have the Kennedy, we have Lincoln, maybe Zachary Taylor to a lesser extent, but Garfield just seems so. I mean, he's well educated, he's super smart, he's young. And it seems like he could have probably done a lot of good.
If you want to do a Garfield tour, this is the place. There's a town called Mentor, Ohio, which is where Garfield's home was. It's open to the public. It was the first presidential library. And so Garfield's home is there. Garfield was the president of what is now Hiram College. And so the college is another site where people go to. The cabin where he was born, or the birthplace. You could do like 4 or 5 Garfield stops here. You could do a whole Garfield tour here. And Grant is in the southern end of the state. In the other side, the southeast corner of the state, you can do like 3 or 4 stops for Grant in this country. So it's a big state for presidents. Because there was a span of time where Ohio elected a lot of presidents, but Garfield was. I mean, he was a big education guy, and he's also one of the 5 presidents who had been Civil War officers in the Union Army who became president. So between Abraham Lincoln and Theodore Roosevelt, there are all those guys people don't know, but 5 of them had fought in the Civil War, starting with Rutherford B. Hayes from Ohio. No, starting with Grant. I'm sorry. Grant from Ohio. Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes from Ohio. Then Garfield from Ohio. Benjamin Harrison, and then William McKinley from Ohio. So not only were these guys officers in the Civil War, they're from Ohio. So that's one of the things about those presidents between Lincoln and TR.
Well, and McKinley, maybe a lot of people see a caricature not knowing, but in The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, there's a point that that Baum may have based the idea. Well, and I always thought that from sort of a political satire standpoint, that's the Emerald City is Washington, D.C., and that the thing that's going to be a humbug is going to be a politician, is going to be so. I do think Baum was going for the Emerald City. I always thought when they did the modern remake of the Broadway The Wiz, and the characters, the Emerald City was New York City, and I thought that's wrong. It's wrong. It should be Washington. That should be the capital they're heading for, not the Empire State Building. I thought that was you're missing the whole point of what Baum went for here. And but McKinley's interesting too, is because McKinley suffers in also the fact that TR succeeds him, and TR is such a charismatic president, and TR is such a he's the big game hunter, he's the rough rider, he's the soldier, he's the the outdoorsman, he's the TR carries the spotlight with him, so McKinley pales too in the fact that he's going to be followed by Roosevelt.
Well, and kind of getting back to maybe people that were influenced off of some of Poe's stuff, as far as like the city of Boston, it seems like they were a pretty big hotspot for the spiritualist movement and stuff. And do you think, I mean, because there's the whole thing about the Boston medium Marjorie and her duel with Houdini, and how Houdini eventually debunked her. And somewhere in my room, I have Houdini's pamphlet on that. But do you think, is there something about Boston that just gravitates more to Poe? And the death cult idea. I mean, obviously,
It
like you
really,
said, it's a really rough and tumble city back in the day.
no, Baltimore was the rough and tumble city.
Yeah,
Baltimore was the tough city.
yeah, not
Well, not
Boston.
Boston.
Sorry,
No, no, no.
getting bees mixed up.
But Poe has a problematic relationship with Boston because even though he's born there and his mother loved Boston, one of the few things Poe was given from his mother was an oil painting that his mother had done of Boston Harbor, and on the back of it, she left the painting to him and wrote something like to my darling Edgar, with the hopes that he'll grow to love Boston as much as his mother does, and he didn't. He did not. Um, and one of the reasons is that Boston is the seat of American intellectual and literary elite, and Poe has a difficult relationship with, particularly the transcendentalist. Um, he thought Boston, I think, was emblematic of all the problems he saw with American literature, that they were copying England and were very much under the influence of the Brits. And he also saw that they were another club that excluded him. So he went after him. He went after particularly Longfellow, who was a great guy. Longfellow was a mensch. Longfellow was a total nice guy, and Longfellow never returned fire against Poe, and even said things which were very understanding of Poe. But Poe wasn't wrong about Longfellow. Who reads Longfellow today? Longfellow was enormously popular. He was one of what are called the poets of the hearth, who wrote these great, warm, long poems, and which would be read at the fireside with families around. And Poe correctly predicted that Longfellow's fame would not last many generations, and it didn't. And but I think Poe was jealous of Longfellow, who had a great life, who lived, in this wonderful old house and had a wife and family and taught, and in many ways, I'm sure Poe looked at it and said, "That's the life I should have had," And he has this kind of battle with Boston, and then I think part of it is because he is always made to feel like an outsider, and he doesn't feel truly accepted by the literary. And he knows he's better than they are. That's another thing. He knows this has got to really irk him, and it does. So he and Boston have this kind of uh, problematic relationship, and even at that, he publishes his first volume of poems in Boston. He published it anonymously, and he uses the pseudonym A Bostonian because he was born there, so he could use that. And there's evidence that he might have even been considering settling in Boston at the end of his life, going to that area. So it's hard to say. It was like with a lot of things with Poe. It's hard to say, but he definitely has a difficult relationship with the literary elite of Boston, not necessarily the Boston people. Boston does not have any surviving structures that are that can be tied directly to Poe, the way Philadelphia and Baltimore do, and New York. But I'll tell you what Boston does have. Boston has the best statue devoted to Poe ever. If you look at Richmond, was the city that when Poe dies, Richmond really views Poe as their own, and there's mourning in Richmond because they really look at him as a native son in a lot of ways. So Richmond was the first to put up a statue, and it's in front of the state capitol in Richmond, and it's a picture. It's the statue is Poe sitting, holding a manuscript. It's a very staid statue. It's a very cold and a poor representation of Poe. And then you go up to to Baltimore, and Baltimore's got a statue of Poe sitting too, but he's leaning kind of forward, and he's sort of almost coming out of the chair. There's a little bit of action. It's a much better statue. And then you go to Boston, and in the middle of Boston, there's a statue in a park, and it's Poe in full stride. and he's got a valise, and out of the valise is flying a raven. And this is the way Poe actually moved too, in full stride and full with a lot of energy, and it's an immersive statue. You can walk around the statue. It's a great statue. It's a fantastic. So Boston is sort of, this is, I think, in some ways Boston's peace offering, because they put up the greatest statue to Poe, who was born in Boston. You can never take that away from Boston. Poe was a Boston native. He will always, you cannot take away from the place you were born. You can't change it. So, Boston has now got the best statue of Edgar Allan Poe by far. Look it up. Look it up online, statue Boston, and then go, holy Jay, that's a great statue.
No, I kind of like how you put that. It's kind of like, hey, we're sorry about what happened. Because, like, going down to Texas, when we did our Texas trip for JFK and what we're filming we did down there, like, obviously Dallas has theirs, but like Fort Worth has a super ornate, like, just beautiful, there's words, there's pictures, there's a beautiful statue of JFK, and it's like, why is this one so much better?
Well, I mean, Dallas is always going to have a problematic relationship with this. It's that one goes deep.
Right.
That one runs deep,
Yeah, you can't get away from like somebody walking up telling you about it. It's like, yeah, I know. I went through history class.
It's the city where, for wherever you put with a blame, where an American president was shot down, and then his the suspected assassin is in police custody. Is
It's assassinated.
No matter what you think, and there is always endless debate. It's still, there's no way you can say this without it sounding awful, without it sounding just beyond horrible. And
right.
it is horrible.
Yeah.
So,
and then Ruby goes mad in Dallas and dies, and
listen, I was 7 years old. I remember it being played out on TV. I watched live when Ruby shot Oswald.
Oh, really?
Yeah. We were all glued to the TV set that whole weekend. We got, came home from school that Friday. We had heard over the loudspeaker that the president had been shot in Dallas. We were all sent home on the buses, and then for the next, right on through to the service in Arlington, we were glued to the set. And so, as a kid, you're there watching, and all of a sudden, you see somebody gunned down in front of you, on the screen. It was, it was a sobering moment, and I remember my father saying, what anybody would assume watching this is, well, they silenced him. This was, they just, what else were you to think that if somebody gets shot down in the basement of police headquarters,
Right.
It was not an illogical assumption to come to at that point, so, it's, I'm about the youngest that you can get to of the who asked the question, where were you when you heard that JFK was assassinated? That was a big question for my generation growing up. You remembered where you were. For a lot of us at that age, we were in school. We remember. I was in the second grade. So, you're never going to forget. Now that's different for different generations. That question changes as you go through the succeeding years. For later generations, where were you when you found out about the Twin Towers? Where were you when, whatever. But for my generation, it was, where were you when you heard that JFK was assassinated?
Yeah. It's amazing how something about negative emotion, like negative events, always like stick with you, like so well. Like you said, I can remember exactly where I was when the Twin Towers, like all that went down. But kind of,
go ahead.
I was going to say, getting back to Poe, because I had an interesting question that I was kind of thinking of just now. Because I know you were saying you didn't want the death like solved completely, right?
Mm-hmm.
But earlier you said, like, what if we had a picture of him smiling? Like, do you want them? Like, would you like them to find that, or do you kind of like?
Yeah, we'll never find it. See, What you're talking about is the difference of how pictures were taken. all of Poe's pictures were taken in studios, and the
Or at
lens was
least
the same.
maybe in different clothing, so he's not black
Yeah.
clothing all the
So,
time.
I mean, you basically, the only pictures of Poe we have even if we find new pictures of Poe, since he died in 1849, Poe would have had to live long enough into what was called the Kodak. The Kodak camera was the first candid camera, and for a long time, getting your picture taken back then was called getting Kodaked. And this was the first time your family could take pictures of you, and you could take pictures of your family and your friends. Everybody could have a box camera, and you could go out on a holiday or wherever, and you could take pictures. So when you get into the second half of the 1800s, especially towards the end, you now have a whole, and then the invention of flash photography too comes about. All of this allows for pictures to be taken in circumstances they never could be taken before. Journalistically, it's a big move too, because you can document poverty in the New York ghettos like you could never do. You could tell people what it looked like. Now you could show them. Now you could show them what it looked like. Now, if Poe had lived into that era, we undoubtedly would have pictures of him playing music duets with his wife, or playing in the front yard or whatever. We would have candid pictures of him, and that would change. We have candid pictures of Twain.
Mm-hmm.
We have candid pictures of people who lived into the late 1800s, early 1900s. So if Poe had made it, a little bit longer, the way we took pictures would have changed. But the fact that he dies in 1849 means that what you're talking about will never be discovered. It's impossible for it to be discovered because there was no candid photograph at that time, and that's the difference. That's always going to be the difference with with this, and the photographic record is never going to change that much as far as Poe goes.
Yeah, we won't get that picture like we have of Wyatt Earp just relaxing in a chair and not being a
Right.
gunfighter out there. And
Right.
but like, do you think like a picture pops up and he's like in white, that would throw everyone off?
Oh yeah, I think anything that would, and like I said, I'm in favor of expanding our view of Poe. I'm in favor of even without that, just acknowledging, because again, if you like that guy, if you like, this guy, the action figure with the raven perched on his shoulder, if you like this guy, and I like this guy, I think this guy's great. Look how pale he is, by the way. Look, I mean, we almost looks like he's just stepped out of the Addams Family. The way this is going. But if you like this guy, and I do, then you should be interested in who was the real guy who wrote those stories you like so much. We don't have any problem accepting the fact that Stephen King likes to go to Boston Red Sox games, and there's a big part of Stephen King who's just a big down-to-earth guy. We have no problem accepting most people who do this kind of thing. We don't confuse them with that and say, oh, this guy must be just perpetually lives in the Munsters house, and has all this kind of thing. We do insist on this with Poe, and it what it does is, you cannot understand the guy who wrote The Raven and The Telltale Heart unless you get behind the funhouse mirror reflection we've made of him. You've got to get behind that and say, yes, he was a genius at doing this, but this is why. It didn't just come, flying out of his brain because he was a mad genius. He was a very hard worker. It takes a lot of hard, no matter how much talent you have, no matter how much genius you have, that always has to be applied to hard work, extraordinarily hard work. And, we don't think Beethoven just dashed off his symphonies. We look at Beethoven, and behind the symphonies, we see the amount of work that went into the symphonies. We don't think that a writer like Dostoevsky just dashed off Crime and Punishment. And we think, oh, think of the amount of work and craftsmanship that went into that. But with Poe, we're willing to accept that this somehow just came flying off the top of his head. And that's not how he worked. And he worked very, very hard at making this really authentic. I mean, Poe was a writer who wrote with all his senses. And even today, a lot of modern writers, very popular ones, forget this one simple rule of writing. And how many novels have you read where it's dialogue, 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 and here's a line, a dialogue, here's a line? Poe gave you great dialogue, but sound was important to Poe. Light was important to Poe, gradations of light, and just the precise word to put across what that sound must have been or what that light must have been like. Poe gives you smell, Poe gives you sound, Poe gives you light. He's always writing with all his senses. Everything's alive, and that's a very, very careful craftsman. Poe, the greatest, what separates really, really terrific, wonderful writers from great writers is usually a very, very strong sense of place. Writers who give you a very, very strong sense of place, like Flannery O'Connor was just amazing at this. Mark Twain was amazing at this. They have a very strong sense of place. And Poe doesn't get enough credit for this because his sense of place sometimes as a torture chamber, or sometimes a dungeon, or sometimes a cheap boarding house, or a crumbling mansion. But the sense of place is no sense stronger because it's imaginative than it is for anybody else. So this is something which Poe, when he commits to that strong sense of place, he's not just going to give it to you in one sense. He's going to use all his senses to do it. And that's one of the things that Poe surely does not get enough credit for as an artist.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of funny you brought up he looks like he came out of the Addams family.
The way we portray him.
Yeah. Well,
the way we portray him, yes.
Because the Wednesday Addams show, there's substantially a ton of
a lot of Poe references.
Yeah, I mean, Nevermore Academy, the Poe.
It always have been, by the way. I mean,
yeah.
Look, this is one of the things about Poe, which is this kind of fame being this double-edged sword with Poe. I mean, on the one hand, this kind of thing has really taken his celebrity to a new thing. And Poe has tremendous street cred. I mean, he always has. He always had, from the point that Universal made those movies with Karloff and Lugosi, and you carry it through. He's on the cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. He's not only on the cover, he's got the top center position. He's name-checked in songs by Bob Dylan and John Lennon. His song, one of his poems, Annabelle Lee, has been adapted into popular song many times over and over and over again by everybody from, country artists to Stevie Nicks. He's been used as a character on The Simpsons and on South Park. He's constantly referenced, and his stories are constantly referenced in.
I mean, even in SpongeBob
movies. SpongeBob did their own take on the Telltale Heart. How much street cred do you possibly need? How there's always been a cool factor to Edgar Allan Poe, and it's kind of all goes back to that one small group of stories again. It goes back to the spooky guy, and so that feeds the stereotype as well. But again, it's a double-edged sword. It helps propel his reputation into the stratosphere, which is great. And it also keeps us from seeing who the complete writer was.
So if you could tell the viewers a non-stereotypical Poe story to read, which one would you tell them to go check out?
The System of Dr. Tar and Dr. Feather is very good. It's a story that sometimes, even though it's definitely satire and it's definitely humorous, sometimes gets lumped in with the horror stories. No, never bet the devil your head, which is a satire on sort of moralistic stories. Um, it actually has been adapted. There's a movie that was done in the 1960s called Spirits of the Dead, and it's a European picture, even though it was done with some American stars and British stars. And it's an anthology film. Terrence Stamp is in it. Jane Fonda is in it. There's, but one of the stories is Never Bet the Devil Your Head. It's a modern take on Never Bet the Devil Your Head. So you could definitely go to some of those stories which have a kind of a more humorous bent. And even among the horror stories, there are some stories which are not as well known. There's a story called Hop Frog, which was one of the last major stories he wrote, and it's a revenge story, like The Cask of Amontillado. It's a revenge story, and but your sympathies are entirely with the character who's seeking revenge, and it's an amazing story. It really is just an amazing story, and again, it's one of the few stories that were written out of that golden period I was talking about, and it's late in his career, because Poe at the end, after his wife Virginia dies, he kind of falls apart. His life falls apart, and the last 2 years of his life are a little bit silly, as he's going from woman to woman, courting one woman after another, sort of looking to replace the lost Virginia. And this is also one of the few very fallow periods of his life where he's not writing that much. He's not writing much of anything for a couple of years. And then at the very end, it's almost like, when somebody's dying, how many times have you heard somebody say that there's this moment where they have this almost blush of health, where they look wonderful for right before the end? They have this kind of time where they reassert themselves, and they never look better for a little while.
And some energy and all this and that.
Yeah. And well, from a literary standpoint, Poe kind of has this. At the end, he has this kind of return to writing, but more importantly, this return to poetry, because he writes most of his poetry at the beginning. That's the first thing he does. That's the first thing he writes, and then it's in the 1820s as a young man, he's writing poetry, and then when he's in Baltimore, he starts to enter contests for short stories, and he finds out he's got a knack for this, and then he moves to Philadelphia, and this is where he's writing the short stories. And he doesn't write much poetry, although he writes The Raven, so he writes a really big poem at this. And he does write other poems. He's not got this concentration on poetry that he has at the very beginning of his career. But at the end, he has this kind of return to poetry, this triumphant return to poetry. And he writes some of his best poems in this last blush of talent. In this last period, he writes The Bells. Amazing poem. He writes El Dorado, which is about the California gold rush and the seeking of riches and what the true dominion of riches are. And he writes Annabel Lee. And the Bells, both Annabel Lee and the Bells are posthumous poems. They're both not published until after his death. And Annabel Lee is like, this probably his second best known poem. So he has this kind of return to poetry at the end, where he returns to his first love. He returns to his first literary love, and he does some amazing work. So there is this revival of him as a writer at the end, and it's really wonderful to see, in his career, that he marshals his forces and he returns to his first love, and he just creates some amazing stuff. That should raise the question of what would have happened after. We doesn't, kind of, because that's sort of like the last act. And we says, okay, this is it. He has this final return to poem, and this is where it's supposed to end. It kind of ends with Annabel Lee. And not technically the last piece, but it might as well be. And what a poem to go out on. What an amazing poem to go out on, if that is the end.
Right. Yeah, one of those encores like you were talking at the beginning. It's just like, wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sam, since I've hijacked the conversation, did we cover all your questions, or do you have any left
I mean,
over?
you basically covered my questions. I do have a question about your book of cat lovers,
Yeah.
just because I have a bunch of cats. I was very curious what that one was about.
That's one of my 5 Mark Twain centric books. Mark Twain for cat lovers. And this book, I actually carried this idea for this book around from the mid 1990s until this was published around 2017. And I carried it. I had done a book on Mark Twain on writing, about collecting all of Mark Twain's thoughts on the writing process, called Mark My Words, Mark Twain on Writing. And then I thought about doing this book next. And then I sort of sidetracked it, got involved with other things, and it was delayed. And this book came about because my agent was really excited about selling the Twilight Zone book. I had come up with this idea about doing the life lessons of the Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone is morality tales. The book that finally became everything I need to know I learned in the Twilight Zone. And she was really eager to get out there and sell it, which she did, and she tried to. She couldn't find a publisher as quickly and as easily as she thought. So while she was waiting, she sort of looked. We had a conversation where she said, "What else are you thinking about? Is there something else?" And I said, "Yeah, I've had this idea that I've been carrying around for like 20 years about how you could." Mark Twain was fascinated with cats. He loved and adored cats. He had cats his entire life. And I thought, if you could take all of the pictures of Mark Twain with cats, and we have a lot of pictures. Now, here's a very good example of what I was talking about, the candid photograph. We have, because Twain lived long enough, we've got lots and lots of pictures of him with cats. He loved posing with cats. He loved having them. And Twain was an animal lover. Twain, there was something about Twain that just responded. And his mother, Jane Clemens, she could not bear to see an animal mistreated. She once stopped this big burly guy on the streets of St. Louis from beating a horse. She went up and snatches. This little woman goes up and snatches the whip away from this guy. And so Twain was raised with this idea of animals being treated humanely, and so he loved. But he didn't like having dogs around because dogs barked, and he concentrated. And he hated that would take you right out. He loved cats because cats were quiet and they were and he responded to them. So I thought, what if you could assemble all of the stories about Twain with cats, things that he wrote about cats, and the things like this, and put them all into one book and sort of go through Mark Twain's life by using the filter cats and how the cats are current, because he's got them right from childhood all the way to his dying day in Stormfield, Connecticut. He's got cats in his life. And if you could just take Twain through his life in the company of cats, he made up stories about cats for his daughters. We have records of them, and they're in the book. He made up these delightful stories about cats. So if you look at sort of on the equation of where Twain was, what kind of well, he loved all animals, but he was definitely a cat person, and he had sayings about cats. He had just he various things that he said about cats, like that if a man loves a cat, he is my friend right away, without exception. He is admitted to my heart. He once said that a home without a cat, and a properly loved and petted cat, might still be a home, but how can it prove title? He once said that if man could be crossed with the cat, it would improve the man, but it would deteriorate the cat. So he's got these constant stories about him. They run throughout all his works, and that's kind of what went into the book. Intriguingly, the book has become one of my best-selling books. It's way up there, and I did not write it with that in mind, with thinking that this is going to be a surefire gift book or something. But in sort of combining Mark Twain and cats, I did come up with apparently was a great gift idea, because this book has remained in print since it was published. and it continues to return a very good royalty check. It was published in 2016, so that's going on 7 years ago, and it still remains it still chugs along really strong, and so I have a lot of affection for it. But it's one of 5 Mark Twain books that I've done, and it's definitely, if you're a cat lover, you'll definitely get a charge out of it. Not the least of reason because Twain himself was a big cat lover. And I am too. Like I said, I've had cats my entire life.
Same.
And I have 2 now, both interestingly enough black cats. By the way, Poe also was a cat person. Poe had a cat that was very, very important to him named Katerina, tortoiseshell cat that they had gotten in Philadelphia. The cat moves with them from Philadelphia to New York, to Manhattan, and then to the Bronx. And Katerina outlives him a little bit. She actually survives him. But there's a drawing of Poe. It's not a picture or anything, but there was a drawing done of Poe writing in the house, in the cottage in Fordham, and Katerina is sitting on his shoulder. And she would sit on his shoulder while he wrote. And it's interesting because there are pictures of Twain with cats, because Twain loved putting a cat on his shoulder and walking around. And some cats are shoulder riders.
Yep.
Yeah, I have a cat right now named Dickens. Interestingly enough, he's a black cat, and Dickens is a shoulder rider. He loves, just walking around, being up there. So, so Twain and Poe both had that in common. They were both cat people, and they were both cat lovers. So you remember Poe wrote the story The Black Cat. He didn't write The Black Dog. So
true. This is very true.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, and there was something in Poe, like Twain, that responded to the cat. And the stories about Katerina are delightful. They're in the book, and this is the family pet. He did not have a raven. He did have.
Cool,
he played to that. I mean, like I said before, how he would play to the fame. There's a point in the last couple years of his life, a friend of his brought his daughter to meet him in the cottage in Fordham on a very nice day. Fordham at that time in the Bronx was the country. There was nothing but woods, and it was all uncultivated land up there. So he had a little cottage, and it was surrounded by woods and trails, which he loved because he loved walking. He loved getting out and walking. And this young woman she wanted to meet the guy who had written The Raven. So her father brought him to the cottage. And Poe plays. I mean, he knows exactly. So they go into the cottage, and she's looking around, and he knows she's looking for the Raven. And there's a picture of a woman in the sitting room of the cottage, and she's staring at the picture, and he looks at her. He says, "It's not the lost Lenore." He knows what she's thinking. He knows, and he's kind of plays, and he knows what his image is. So he's kind of playing with her and sort of saying, "I'm not that guy." He's having a little fun with it. So no, there is no pet raven, but there is a pet cat, and the stories about the cat are very, are charming and touching. When his wife Virginia is dying, Virginia died at the same age that his mother died, of the same thing, tuberculosis. And when Virginia is dying, they are in desperate straits, and it's the middle of winter. Virginia dies in January, and she's dying. It's pitiful. I mean, the house can't even be properly warmed. So they put her in the bed. They put every cover they have on her. Poe takes his greatcoat, his army greatcoat, puts that over her, and then, as if knowing, Katerina gets on top of the greatcoat to keep her warm as much as possible as she's dying. So the cat is very much part of the household. So, like I say, if you're a cat person, so is Poe. Very much.
Definitely am. Grew up with 9 of them.
I'm sorry?
I grew up with 9 cats.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I've had cumulatively, I've had more than 9, but not at the same. I think the most I've had at the same time is 5. There was one point when we had 5 cats, and that was the most. But we've also had dogs. We've had 4 dogs. We have a dog now. We had a rabbit, a Chinese water dragon. So like Twain, I do like animals. I'm just an animal person. There's something in me that responds to that too. But also like Twain and Poe, cats first. In my heart.
Yep. Yeah, we have like 5 now at this point, but we had like 9 at one point, and it was like 7. Now it's 5, and 2 dogs, a bunch of chickens, ducks, and geese, a couple horses.
Well, and I think that speaks well, because somebody who just responds to animals is opening themselves up to something that taps into a greater sensibility. I don't understand people who don't. I don't understand people who somehow can live without that. I've never been able to, but again, it's to each their own. But all I could say is, like I said, Twain and almost every writer, almost every single writer of note was either or both a dog or a cat person. There's something there that a matter of fact, last year on Facebook, on my Facebook page, I did a gallery of 51 images of writers with cats. And so I could easily find 51 images. Now you have to imagine, who are we talking here? Who we do? Well, obviously Twain and Poe, but also Dickens, William Butler Yeats, Tennessee Williams. It's just a staggering. Anne Rice. It's a staggering number of people. And then I did the same thing the next day with dogs. I did 51 images of writers with dogs. 10 of the writers were in both galleries. 10 writers were in both galleries. But most of them were either dog people or cat people. Most of them were one or the other. And I think that, but I think the important thing is that something in them responded to one or the other. That's a total of like 90 writers, 90 famous writers from all different genres. I think you'd have a hard time finding somebody who wasn't, in tune with one or the other.
One question I had that you can talk to the audience about, and Sam, is Twain's perspective on Poe.
Oh, well, it was kind of a divided judgment. Twain liked Poe's poetry. He did not care for Poe's stories. And probably because Poe's, the language that Twain is almost the embodiment of what Poe called for. Poe called for America to develop its own voice. Twain sort of answers that call, not knowing he is answering Poe's call. Twain writes in the vernacular. He gives a book which is completely narrated by an uneducated boy, a Southern boy. So Twain is in many ways accomplishes what Poe called for, and later on William Dean Howells calls Twain the Lincoln of our literature, saying he set our literature free. Because he opened up all the possibilities. Hemingway says that all American literature comes from one book, Huckleberry Finn. There's been nothing before. There's been nothing as good since. So there was something in Twain which admired the poetry. He didn't like the way Poe wrote stories because it was alien to him. But there were other writers he didn't despise the way Poe wrote, the way he truly despised some authors like James Fenimore Cooper. Twain went after Fenimore Cooper like nobody's business. He wrote 2 essays about Fenimore Cooper's literary offenses. Jane Austen, he really went after Jane Austen. He once said that he had read one of Jane Austen's books, and all he could think about after finishing it was that they allowed her to die a natural death. Another time, he said every time he read, I think it was Pride and Prejudice. I think he said every time he read Pride and Prejudice, he wanted to dig her up and beat her over the head with her own shin bone. So he's he goes after Jane Austen, but the one he really went after even more than Jane Austen and James Fenimore Cooper, with Sir Walter Scott. He just thought Sir Walter Scott's stuff was just awful, and it's all this old chivalry stuff. And I think he also resented the fact that Sir Walter Scott was probably the most popular author in the pre-Civil War South, and that a lot of those, nonsense codes of dueling and chivalry and all of that came from Sir Walter Scott. And Twain said that the South suffered from Sir Walter Scott's disease, and at one point blamed the entire Civil War on Sir Walter Scott, which is a bit extreme, to blame the entire Civil War on a one British author. But certainly, if you looked at the writers that Twain despised the most, Sir Walter Scott probably was way up there. Then James Fenimore Cooper was second. Jane Austen was third. These were the three he really, really went after the most. And with Poe, while he expressed admiration for Poe's poetry, he once said that his prose was like Jane Austen's, and then he said, "No, I'll amend that. I could read Poe's prose on salary. I couldn't do that with Jane Austen." So he really goes after Jane. Like I said, Poe's prose style just did not speak to him very well. So, but Poe is pretty far. He's not really way up on the list of the writers that Twain really went after. And again, he does express some admiration for him. Theodore Roosevelt, interestingly enough, who was one of our best read American presidents, not only best read, but he was also an author himself. And this was an era where he actually wrote the books. He actually wrote his own speeches and actually wrote his own books. And Roosevelt ends up, who only lives to be about 60. I mean, he doesn't get past 60, and had a bad heart most of his life. But Roosevelt read voraciously, and he wrote just as much. And he read Twain and Poe. And even though he and Twain sparred on political subjects, they disagreed on almost everything politically. When Roosevelt went into the African wilderness on an expedition for the Smithsonian, he took his own a little portable library with him, so he could read at the end of every day. And he took both Poe and Twain with him in that little personal library. So he spoke with great admiration for Poe's stories, and he spoke with great admiration for Twain's writing, even though politically they were at odds with each other.
Fascinating.
Well, yeah, and they are, because once you get to what's called the American century, the 20th century, the dawn of the 20th century, the two most conspicuous Americans in that first 10 years are Mark Twain and Theodore Roosevelt. Not even close. And they disagree on where America's destiny is. And they're both right and they're both wrong. It's just that, Roosevelt, who had studied naval power at Harvard, and as a matter of fact, his thesis at Harvard was about the use of naval power during the War of 1812. He understood that America needed a great navy if it was going to take its place among the world powers. And he also realized something else, that if you had a great navy, you also had to have something else. You had to have possessions. You had to have bases where that navy could get refueled around the world. So Roosevelt goes and fights in the Spanish-American War as a colonel in the Spanish-American War, emerges a hero of the Spanish-American War. Twain is in favor of the Spanish-American War. Most Americans are in favor of the Spanish-American War because of how Spain was treating Cuba, and they saw it as liberation for Cuba. Once the Spanish-American War is over and America claims Spain's possessions, like the Philippines and Cuba, and turns them into places where we can have naval bases, Twain is appalled. Twain is now like, this is not why we were supposed to fight this war. and we have no right taking these any more than Spain had a right to these possessions. We have no right to these possessions. Twain was an anti-imperialist, and he once said, the American eagle should not be putting its talons in other places that it does not own. And Roosevelt at the same time understands that without those possessions, America does not take its place among the world powers. So they both have very legitimate arguments to make, but it's going to put them in direct opposition with each other. And the other thing that's going to put them in direct opposition is they are both hams of the first magnitude. They both love the spotlight, and they're both constantly grabbing the spotlight. And you can only have one most conspicuous American, and they both thought they should be it. So there's also this kind of pulling and shoving that goes on between them. At the same time, they were both utterly charmed with each other when they met. When they encountered each other was on several occasions. They both admitted they couldn't help being charmed by the other. So interesting relationship.
Yeah, Teddy is a very interesting person. So many great adventures, but yeah, I mean, he definitely wanted the attention to a point where a lot of people view like his rerunning where we just end up getting Woodrow Wilson instead as like, oh man, what did you do, Teddy?
Well, I mean, the Bull Moose campaign was, he does see the Republican Party drifting away from him under the Taft administration. He does see this as a betrayal by Taft, who was one of his political, followers. And then he sees the nomination stolen from him by the political bosses. I mean, he's definitely the most popular candidate in 1912. And then he lets it get away from him. He lets it, by running. And even there, remember, TR plays second in that. I mean, he's the third party candidate. He's the only third party candidate in the modern era to have ever, placed second in the presidential race. So, I mean, he makes quite a race of it. But even there, I mean, there's this. He can't. Everything that TR does is dramatic, whether he does it because of his or because somebody else. But it's at the height of the Bull Moose campaign that he gets shot. He gets shot in Milwaukee at point blank range. The bullet passes through his spectacle case and his speech, which is folded. It slowed down the bullet enough that it didn't kill him, and the bullet lodged in his chest. And that his musculature was so impressive that probably helped too. He's bleeding, but he insists on going on to the auditorium and makes his speech. And he stands on his feet for a couple hours and makes his speech. And then he allows himself to be taken to the hospital. That is so TR. That is so TR. And he basically says when they take him onto the speech, he says, I'm going to make this speech or I'm going to die making it. Then he goes on to the platform. He tells the audience who doesn't know. He says, I'm going to ask you all to be very quiet, but I've just been shot. And that's what the audience did. They go dead quiet. And then he says, it doesn't matter whether I live or die. It's the cause that's important. And I'm ahead of the game anyway. I've lived a great life. And if I die right now, I'm ahead of the game. And then goes on to talk for 2 hours. That is so TR. It just doesn't, it just doesn't get it. And again, and when, he takes out the speech to deliver the speech, he sees the bullet hole. The bullet goes right through the speech. So he's holding up the speech and it says, and he says to the audience, because the speech is so thick, he intends to speak for 2 hours. It probably saved his life. If he only was going to talk for 5 minutes, he probably would have died. It probably wouldn't have been enough to slow down the bullet enough. So he says to the audience, it pays to be verbose. He makes a joke of this, on the stand. And, and then, he goes on. The doctors, they don't repeat what they did to Garfield. They basically figured this bullet's too close to the heart. he can live with it. So he lives with the bullet the rest of his life. It remains lodged in his chest for the rest of his life. So that's TR. That that's TR. It's just it's like it's there's no part of his life that's dull. There's parts of his life that are controversial. There are parts of his life you can certainly disagree with, but it's never dull. It's not TR.
Yeah. No, that what you said too is very reminiscent of Houdini, where the doctor's like, "You need to go to the doctor," and he's like, "I'm gonna go on stage if
Yeah,
it's
but
my
that
last
does
show."
kill him.
Yeah. And then he ends up
Yes.
dying on Halloween, and
And
7
not a
days
pleasant. I
later.
mean, peritonitis is not a great way to go. I mean,
Mm,
it's top of very. I mean, there's always been the debate about whether the blows to his abdomen did anything, but that is not what causes it. He probably would have, it would have ruptured anyway.
yeah.
And so that probably isn't what killed him. But yeah, I mean, but Houdini's another one. I mean, this is a guy who's just you've got a lot of guys who love the spotlight,
Mhm.
who are very good at grabbing that's the bigger than life American characters, and that of the early part of the 20th century seems to really we just seem to produce them time and
Right.
time again.
Yeah, just so many different characters that are. I mean, these guys are going to go on and be known well down the line.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. So, but and again, it's one of those things that tie. I have a book on TR. I have a book on in Mark Twain, and it's all tied together. It all somehow ties together.
Well, speaking of books, do you have any plans for a future one? Or are you still kind of in the process of, this
Well,
one?
the thing I
And
want to do next is I want to revise the Night Stalker book. The Kolchak book has been out of print since 2007. So I am probably going to revise that next. I think that's the way I want to get it. The prices on that have gone through the roof, and there are a lot of Kolchak fans out there who would like to have a reasonably priced edition of it. So I would like to do a reprint with some new material updating that. I did that for the Columbo book a few years ago, and it proved very successful. And so that's the next thing. After that, I would be very, very hesitant to predict what the next book might be, because I'll be wrong, because I've always been wrong. You can go right back to the very beginning. My first book was a piece of theater history, and that was published in 1982. And people asked then, what's your next book going to be? Which is a very flattering question, because it always starts with the supposition that there is going to be another book. And that's never a given. Um, And at the time, I was pretty sure I knew what the next book was going to be. I was determined to write a history of the Twilight Zone, and that's what I told people I was going to do. And I had actually done some interviews for it, but I was living in Upper East Tennessee at the time. Not the best place to research a book on the Twilight Zone, but I was doing enough interviews to kid myself. And then in late 1982, I walked into a bookstore, and there it was, The Twilight Zone Companion by Mark Scott Zicree. Great book, great book. But he had written the book that I wanted to write. So I immediately set my sights on another favorite TV show, which was Columbo. And I wanted to write as good a book on Columbo as as Mark had done on The Twilight Zone. So that book was published in 1989 as The Columbo File. And then people asked me, then, what's your next book? And I said, I know what my next book's going to be after The Columbo File, because I've got a handshake deal with this publisher. And I'm going to do a book on Dashiell Hammett. And we've come up with a concept. We all like it. We all know it. We've all kind of agreed, but we hadn't signed the contract yet. And the owner of that press was Warner Books. They stepped in at that point and said, your press is no longer a nonfiction press. It's strictly a fiction press. You've got to get rid of all your pending nonfiction deals. So I was left without a publisher. So I was wrong again, And it was at that point that a small publisher in New York came forward and said, I love your Columbo book. Have you ever thought about doing the same type of book about the Night Stalker, about the Kolchak character? And I said, well, I love that. I became a journalist because of the Culz character. But I didn't think there was a publisher crazy enough to do that book. And he said, well, I'm crazy enough to do that book. So I did that book. And that's been the pattern of my life, right? Every time I say that's going to be the next book, it's not. Fate steps in and says, no, 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 I mean, and then 30 years later, I got my Twilight Zone book. It took me 30 years, but, 30 years after, 35 years after saying, that I was going to do a book on the Twilight Zone, I got my Twilight Zone book because then fate said, now you're ready to do this. Now's the time. That's like the thing about writing, as a career, anything artistic. You can think you're in charge. You can think, you're the captain of your ship, master of your destiny. I'm making the decisions. And when you step back and you look at the pattern of your life, you realize life pushed you in certain directions. And either you were pushed you where you were supposed to be at certain points. And that's why I say, I've always been wrong, but I've always been rewarded for being wrong. I always got something better happened because of that. And I would have never gotten to the Twilight Zone if I hadn't written the Night Stalker book. If I had written the Dashiell Hammett book after Columbo, I might have been branded as a mystery guy, strictly a mystery guy. So they would have said, well, he does mystery stuff. But the Night Stalker got me back to my first love with the horror stuff. And it allowed me then to write a book about Dracula, to write a horror novel, to edit collections by Richard Matheson, who became a friend. And all of this was building up the street cred that gave me the perfect resume to write a book about the Twilight Zone. So it was all a big circle, getting me back to the Twilight Zone. I didn't see it. I didn't know that's what now I can look back and go, aha, did I plan it? Was that a design? No, but it worked.
It worked out in the end.
It worked. Yeah, exactly. So, the only thing you are rewarded for is following your passions, following your interest, following your, and that's what all the books really are. I grew up on Long Island in the shadow of Sagamore Hill, Theodore Roosevelt's home on Long Island. So I grew up fascinated with TR. And to be able to write a book about TR was, be able to write one book about Mark Twain, my literary idol, would have been enough. To have 5 of them is just amazing. So in order to have written books about probably the 3 most important television series to me, Columbo, Night Stalker, and Twilight Zone, these are all passions. These are all, they're all labors of love. They all come from the heart, so, and Poe definitely fits in with that, because I've carried Poe throughout my entire life. Most people discover Poe in junior high school, 7th grade, thereabouts. That's about the age for most people. And that's a great thing. It's a wonderful thing because everybody gets it. Curriculum has helped Poe. Like no other author has been helped by curriculum as Poe has. A lot of authors have just dropped out of curriculum, or they come and go. Even Twain is not taught the way he used to. So, but Poe, still there. You get him in the 7th grade, you get him through high school. If you take any college literature courses, you're probably going to get him again. So everybody gets Poe, and you get him at the right age. 7th grade, when for most people reading is a bloody chore. Most people, you always have 1 or 2 kids who like to read, but most kids at that age, they hate reading. They hate reading assignments. And then in the 7th grade, we give them Edgar Allan Poe. And what's Poe doing? He's locking people up in torture chambers. He's walling them up in catacombs. He's, he's dismembering corpses. It's great. It's wonderful. And all of a sudden, reading has not become a bloody chore. It's become a bloody joy. And you're getting this right at the age when your imagination needs this kickstart, and you get Poe. And kids love reading Poe at that age, and teachers love teaching Poe at that age. And you couldn't do it. Well, try it with a contemporary author. Should try it, like with an author of today, and give that same kind of story to seventh graders. You'd have an outcry from one end of the country to the other. You're doing what? You're giving kids stories about murder and dismembering and torture. You can't do this. We do it with Poe, and nobody lifts an eyebrow. Nobody objects, and nobody says because it's Poe. And they all have fond recollections of reading Poe at that age. So it's magic. The two things that have kept Poe going hand in hand is the pop culture and curriculum. They have gone hand in hand to push Poe to heights that no other author has achieved. And again, yes, it is somewhat based on a stereotype, but still it's a pretty powerful combination. And thank goodness, because it probably turns a lot of kids into readers who might not have been otherwise. We always seem to be determined to give students reading assignments that will sure to make them turned off to reading for the rest of their lives. We give them the worst possible things. I don't know who's in charge of curriculum, but whoever it is just almost like they've set out to make sure kids don't want to read. Poe's the antidote to that. And he's the perfect antidote to get to the seventh grade. Because all of a sudden, reading can be something else. Oh, this is reading? Thank goodness. So, curriculum has done a lot for Poe, but Poe has done a lot for turning people into readers.
Very true. Yeah, you said New York there, and there's a character from New York that we've talked about on our channel mainly because we went to the Springs to where his lab was. What are your takes on Nikola Tesla? Yeah.
You know that Twain knew Tesla.
Yeah.
There are pictures of Twain visiting Tesla's laboratory and experimenting with electricity, and you can see Tesla in the background. So
looking ghostly. Yeah.
Tesla's not only a genius. There's another guy who's genius. You try to explain it and try to explain things, and you just keep coming back to genius. Where did it come from? Where did it come genius? But he's also one of these guys who runs so contrary to American capitalism, especially as it's emerging, and how he's crushed under. His reputation is crushed under, and he dies in poverty. He's a martyr because he believes, this all should be free. Which is his sponsors do not believe. It's like, well, if you can't make money off of it, why are we sponsoring you? And well, because it's for the good of people, it's for the good of the planet, it's for the good of mankind. That argument's not going to hold sway. So Tesla is almost like the patron saint to this whole class of people who were crushed under by American, I'm not an anti-capitalist, by the way. I'm just saying, but there is a form of sort of rapacious capitalism, which has steamrolled, people like Tesla. And, and then, we made the American PR machine made a hero of Edison, and they didn't make a villain of Tesla. They just made him a forgotten figure. They just made him a completely forgotten figure. And, that's, because again, Tesla is admirable, not just because of what he was doing, but because of what he wanted to do with it. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, when we went to that neighborhood, because now it's just a neighborhood where his lab was.
Yeah.
But you reach the top of that hill, and we were able to kind of pinpoint where it was based on two of the buildings you see in the picture. Different pictures. But you're just like kind of in awe where you're like, wow, so much of what we have today started here.
This is just, my mother was somebody who really stressed education, and a lot of the reason I'm a writer today is because of my mother. But when I was living in East Tennessee and started my career in newspapers, we would talk every once in a while. She was traveling a lot at this point in her life. And she had gone on I can't remember where they were, but they had gone on a tour somewhere. And my mother and father were the only ones on the tour who were not part of this group. So this is 1979 we're talking about. And the group they were on tour with was the Tesla Society. And this was the first group that was sort of dedicated to perpetuating the memory of Tesla. Yeah. Now, she came back from this trip, and she was never happier than when she had something which, she knew that would be a total surprise to somebody. She always liked telling a story. This was one of the worst things I ever did to my mother. When we got on the phone, she's very anxious to tell me about, this guy, this forgotten guy, and she just knows there's no way in the world I would know who this Tesla was. Now remember, this is 1970. There's been a lot about Tesla, since then. This is 1979 we're talking about. So 2 days before she got on the phone with me, I had seen a play done by a regional theater company called Horsepower, and it was about the TVA coming to the Tennessee Valley, and Tesla was used as a character in the story. And there was a chant about it. We think of you, Tesla, as we plug in. So I learned about Tesla from this play. So my mom gets on the phone and she says, and there were these people on this tour, and they were dedicated to this person who is this lost person in history. And she said, and his name is Tesla. And I said, oh yeah, Nikola Tesla, inventor of. You could tell. I could not see my mother, but I could just see she probably looked like Lee Harvey Oswald right after Jack Ruby shot her. It's like, how did you know this? Everybody knows that. Now this is the bad part. Now I said, well, everybody knows this. Tesla was the alternating current. Everybody knows this. 3 days ago before, I would not have known it. I would have not known it. And I let her swing in the wind on this for about 15 minutes before I confessed that I had not known who Tesla was. If I had not seen this play, and the timing of it just came in just at that point, I'll probably do time in purgatory for that one, because she was so anxious and eager to share this. Oh, Tesla, yeah, everybody knows that. Yeah. Didn't you know it?
That's funny.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one of the forgotten inventors. Yeah, I guess as of now he's kind of come back with movies like The Prestige with David Bowie playing him and Ethan Hawke playing him and Tesla.
Well, and I think also there's been the backlash against Edison.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think one of the things that has sort of reversed this, even on the Big Bang Theory, there was a whole storyline where the guys accuse Sheldon of being Edison. He thinks of himself as Tesla, and I say, no, you're trying to take credit for what all of us are doing. That's Edison, and he thinks of himself, am I Edison? And I'm thinking, gee, this is great. They're using Edison and Tesla in a sitcom, in which scientists are the main characters. This shows you how Tesla has reached a point where he is actually being used as a figure of integrity, of great admiration and integrity. You don't want to be Edison. And I'm thinking, how different was that from 100 years ago when Edison was the guy that Hollywood was making movies about with Spencer Tracy, and was he was the American icon. Edison was built up and sold and packaged as this great thing. And now it's like, no, you don't want to be Edison.
Mm.
You want to be Tesla. So pretty good.
Right. Yeah, so many inventors I just kind of don't get the credit because they all kind of flow into Edison. I think what's his name? Louis LaPrince, who did or is supposedly had done film and then went missing on a train. I know he had put film together, but like the whole thing was he was going to New York and
Mhm.
just went missing and no one ever saw from him again.
And well, like film and television, everybody's working at it, and flight.
Mhm.
You know, everybody wants that moment, and it's like we want that Wright brothers moment at Kitty Hawk, and it's like a lot of people are working at it at the same time, and the principles are all kind of it's the same thing with television. It's like there's so many different things that are happening at different times, and you're sort of say we want that one, we want Alexander Graham Bell, we want Edison. It's a much better story if we make it that way. And it's like, well, probably, this idea was being developed in a lot of different ways from a lot of different, you know, avenues at that time, But, Tesla is actually, the one parallel I have with Poe, besides the fact that uh, they were both, widely misunderstood and underappreciated in their lifetimes, you know. With both of them, you wish you could go back and say, don't worry, you know, you're going to emerge as the better figure in all this. Don't, you'd wish you could go back and just pat them on the back and say, don't worry about it. You know, it
Mhm.
looks bad now, but don't worry about it. You're gonna, and they both died in poverty. They both, so there are some parallels there with Poe.
Yeah, yeah, no, interesting character. Yeah, you talk about flight. I know that was such a big thing. Houdini became the first one to fly in Australia, which is
Yeah,
kind of funny.
DR is the first president. He was actually a former president, but he goes up, which is really kind of gutsy because flight in this point, Roosevelt goes up around 1910, and the guy who took him up crashed and died like a few months later. It's just so it really kind of gutsy, but Roosevelt's sort of like, well, I can't pass up the possibility, of going up in one of these things. So it's not that long after the Wright brothers that he goes up in a plane. And it's like, oh,
Yeah.
this, there's, I mean, TR, the first president to go in a submarine, submerged in a submarine. He's the first to go up in a plane. That's TR. It just he he's constantly out there. It's just like Mark Twain called him the Tom Sawyer of politics. He's always showing off. This is he once said of Twain once said of Roosevelt, you know, he he'd go to Halifax for half a chance to show off, and he'd go to hell for a whole one. And which is odd because that kind of fits Twain too. That's it's like, well, really, yeah, it kind of sounds like you too, Sam.
We should do some future shows where we focus more on Twain or Teddy on Twilight Zone, Night Stalker. But before you leave, we got one important thing, and that's where can people find more about you or find your books?
My website is real tricky. It's myname.com. So markdawidziak.com will take you to my website. There are links to all the Amazon pages for the book. There's background on me as far as the there's a bio page and everything else. So if anybody is bored enough to go looking and wants to find out more, it's out there. And the books are, certainly the ones that are in print are available at Amazon. So that's always a good, first place to start.
Yeah, no, and we definitely recommend A Mystery of Mysteries, and I'll be doing a review of that on the channel. So hopefully we can get you some more press for it. But I've enjoyed this. I hope Sam has as well. But thank you so much for joining. We hope you enjoyed it, and we can do some more in the future.
Oh, as you can tell, you said, the longer ones go 3 hours, and I could have told you I will go 3 hours. This is, I'm, I just have to learn how to, overcome my shyness and come out of my shell a little bit.
Thank you to Mark for joining us on this awesome episode of Culz Interviews. We really covered two really fascinating authors as well as, Teddy and some other topics. So, hey, yeah, make sure to go down in the description below to find some links to Mark Dawidziak's books and websites. That way you guys can read all this fascinating stuff as well. And we definitely hope to have Mark back on in the future. But until next time, guys, for more Culz interviews, click that link to your left. For more about us here at Culz Paranormal, click the link to your right. And don't forget to hit that like and give us a subscribe. And let us know, what's your favorite story by Poe? Tell us in the comments below.